Tonight, we're going to tell the whole story of Albus Dumbledore, the old man with the long silver beard and the half-moon glasses. The greatest wizard of his age, some would say the greatest of any age. The one everyone trusted, the one Harry Potter looked to as almost a grandfather. The one dark wizards feared above all others. But there was so much more to him than the kind old headmaster you think you know. There were secrets. There was a tragedy at the very beginning that shaped everything. There was a summer of dangerous love and terrible ambition. There was a plan so long and so lonely that he carried it in silence for decades, all the way to his own death. And tonight, slowly and gently, we're going to walk through all of it, from the very start. But first, before we begin, let me ask you one small thing, and then I'll ask nothing of you again for the rest of the night. If you enjoy these long, calm stories to drift off to, take one quiet second, right now, and subscribe. That's all. It's the one little thing that lets me keep making these for you, night after night. So go ahead and tap it now, while you're thinking of it, and then you can forget all about it and simply let yourself sink into the story. Because that's the only thing I want from you tonight. To sink. To let the day you've had fall away from you, piece by piece, like a heavy coat slipping off your shoulders. You don't have to remember any of this. There's no test in the morning, no quiz at the end, nothing you have to hold on to. If you follow the whole story of Dumbledore's long and complicated life, wonderful. And if you drift off somewhere in the middle, in his school days, or in the middle of a great war, that's even better, because that means the story did exactly what it came here to do. It carried you off to sleep. The tale is only the boat, rest is the shore, so get yourself comfortable now. Settle into whatever is holding you tonight, the pillow, the blanket, the warmth of the dark. Let your head grow heavy. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they've been holding on all day, because they have been holding on, and they're allowed to stop now. Let your breathing slow. You don't even have to listen closely. My voice is just going to go on, low and quiet and even, and you can hold on to the words or let them blur softly into the dark. Both are perfectly fine. Both lead to the same gentle place. And so we begin, not with the famous old Headmaster of Hogwarts, but with a baby, born well over 100 years before Harry Potter, in a quiet corner of the wizarding world, into a family that looked, from the outside, ordinary and happy, and that was hiding, on the inside, the beginnings of a sorrow that would follow Albus Dumbledore for the rest of his days. Let me take you there, to the very start of it all. And so we come now, gently, to the very beginning of him, to the small, quiet cottage where a boy was born who would one day become the greatest wizard of his age. But that is far ahead of us tonight, and there is no need to rush toward it. For now there is only a family, ordinary in their love and their smallness, living in the soft green folds of the world, long before anyone thought to write their names in books. His name was Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, though those grand names came later, and to those who first knew him, he was simply a bright-eyed baby, the eldest child of Percival and Kendra Dumbledore. You do not need to hold all of these names in your mind. Let them drift past you like leaves on slow water. There will be nothing to remember by morning, nothing you must carry. Just let the story move around you, warm and unhurried, the way a quilt settles when you turn beneath it. Percival was his father, and Kendra was his mother, and in those early days they were young and full of hope, the way young parents so often are. They were a witch and a wizard, though they lived carefully among ordinary folk. the way many magical families did in that time, quietly, gently, keeping the wonder of what they were tucked close to the heart of the home. Kendra was a dark, proud woman, beautiful in a way that made people look twice and then look away, and she carried herself with a stillness that could seem like coldness to strangers, but was, to those who loved her, simply the steadiness of someone who held her family very close. Percival was gentle in his own way, a father who loved his children with a fierce and quiet devotion. The kind of love that does not say much but is always, always there. And into that home came the children, one after another, the way children do, a small procession of little lives filling the rooms with noise and laughter and the ordinary music of a family growing. First there was Albus, the eldest, watchful and clever even as a small boy. Then came Aberforth, the second son, sturdier and rougher around the edges, a boy who loved animals more than books, who was happiest with something living and warm in his hands, a goat to tend, or a bird to feed. And last of all, the littlest of the three, came a daughter. Her name was Ariana. Ariana. Say it softly to yourself if you like, the way you might say the name of someone dearly loved and long gone. Ariana was the baby of the family, the youngest and the brightest, a small girl with a sweetness in her that everyone felt the moment they came near. Her brothers adored her. Aberforth most of all, perhaps, for there was something in gruff, gentle Aberforth that answered to something in her, some quiet understanding that needed no words. And Albus, the clever eldest, loved her too, in the way that clever, ambitious boys love the little sister who thinks the world of them. She was the softest thing in that house, the warm center of it. And for a time, for a few golden years that no one thought to treasure while they had them, the Dumbledores were simply happy. You can rest here for a moment, in that happiness, before the story turns. There is no hurry. Let yourself sink a little deeper into the warmth of the bed. The house is quiet. The children are small. The parents are young. And for now, all is well. But every life has a turning, and Ariana's came when she was only a small girl, 6 years old, no more. It happened the way so many terrible things happen, out of nothing, out of an ordinary afternoon. She was a little girl doing what magical children do without meaning to, without knowing they are doing anything at all, a flicker of something impossible, a moment of accidental magic, the way a child that age might make a toy float or a flower bloom out of season, simply because the wonder inside them spills over. It is nothing to be afraid of, this kind of magic. It comes and goes like weather. In a house of witches and wizards it would have been met with a smile. But Ariana was seen. Some ordinary boys, muggle boys, boys who did not understand magic and had never dreamed such a thing could be real, happened to be near, and they saw her do the impossible, and it frightened them. And frightened people, especially young ones, can be cruel without quite understanding their own cruelty. What happened in that moment, the story tells us gently and does not linger over, was harsh and sudden and wrong. They did not understand what they had seen, and they wanted her to stop, to take it back, to be ordinary, and in trying to force that from a small, gentle girl, they broke something in her that could not be mended. We will not dwell on the details, you and I. This is a story for falling asleep, and there is no need to hold the sharp edges of it. It is enough to know that a little girl was hurt. Hurt not so much in her body as in the deep, hidden place where her magic lived. Something in her that should have grown freely was frightened back into her, folded up and forced down, twisted by the terror of that day. And magic, you must understand, is not a thing that can be truly caged. When it is pushed down into the dark of a person, it does not vanish. It waits. It gathers. And now and then, without warning, and without her wanting it, it would come rushing back out of her, wild and uncontrolled, dangerous even to those she loved most. So the sweet little girl who had been the warm heart of that house became, through no fault of her own, something the family had to protect, and something the family had to be protected from. Not because she was wicked. She was never wicked. She was only wounded, in a place too deep to reach, and the magic in her had become like a storm she could not calm. She would be gentle and loving for long stretches, herself again, the sister they remembered. And then something would rise in her, some frightened surge, and the house would tremble with power she could not hold. It is a sorrowful thing, and I tell it to you softly, the way it deserves to be told, with pity and with tenderness, and with no blame at all for the child who suffered it. Percival, the father, could not bear it. You can understand him, perhaps, even as the story shakes its head at what he did. To see your smallest child, your gentle daughter, harmed so terribly, to know who did it and why, it broke something in him too. And he went after the boys who had hurt her. What exactly he did, the story does not spell out, and we need not imagine it here in the quiet dark. It is enough to say that he took a father's terrible revenge, and that for it, the law of the wizarding world came for him and carried him away. They sent him to Azkaban. That is the prison of the wizarding world, a cold and dreadful place far out on a lonely island in the sea, and it is not a place we will visit tonight, for it is a place without warmth, and we have no need of it. What matters is what Percival did not do, even there, even at the cost of everything. He never told them why. He never explained. He could have spoken of Ariana, of what had been done to her, of the wound that had driven him, and perhaps if he had, they might have understood, might have been gentler with him. But to explain would have been to expose his daughter's secret to the whole world, to mark her as damaged, as dangerous, to have her taken away and studied and shut up somewhere far from those who loved her. And so he chose silence. He chose to be thought a madman, a man who had attacked children for no reason anyone could see, rather than let his little girl's suffering become a thing that strangers whispered about. He never came home. He died in that cold place, years later, still silent, taking the truth with him. And that silence, that heavy, loving, terrible silence, settled over the whole family and never truly lifted. To the world outside, the Dumbledores became a family with a shame on them, a father in prison for something monstrous, and no one who knew the truth would ever speak it. Imagine carrying that, if you can bear to, the whispers, the sidelong looks, the knowledge locked in your chest that the truth was so much sadder and so much more forgivable than anyone would ever be allowed to know. But do not carry it too long. Set it down. This is only a story, and you are safe and warm, and none of this sorrow is yours to hold. It was Kendra, the mother, who bore the family through what came after. With Percival gone, she gathered her 3 children and left the place where they had lived, left the whispers and the ruin of their old life behind, and moved them all to a small village called Godric's Hollow. It is a gentle name for a gentle place, a village of crooked lanes and old stone and a quiet churchyard, the sort of place where a family might hope to disappear into ordinariness. And that was exactly what Kendra wanted. To disappear. To keep her daughter safe, and to keep her daughter's secret buried where no one could ever find it. So she made the household a hidden one. Ariana was kept inside, away from the eyes of the village, away from anyone who might see one of her frightened storms and understand what she was. To the neighbors, if they wondered at all, the Dumbledores were simply private people, a widow and her children keeping to themselves. Only a very few ever knew there was a daughter at all. Kendra guarded her fiercely, tended her, loved her with the whole of her formidable strength, and it was a hard love. A heavy love, the kind that asks everything and shows very little. The house grew quiet and closed, its curtains drawn against the world, and inside it a mother and her damaged daughter lived in a kind of loving captivity, each keeping the other's secret, each bound to the other by a devotion that was also a burden. And this is the house that young Albus grew up in. Hold him in your mind now, if you can still hold anything, a boy of extraordinary gifts, growing up in a home built entirely around a secret and a sorrow. For Albus was gifted, truly, remarkably gifted, in a way that comes along perhaps once in many generations. From his earliest years, it was clear that his mind was something rare, quick and deep and hungry, reaching always for more than the world around him seemed able to give. When he went away to Hogwarts, the great castle school where young witches and wizards learn their craft, he did not merely do well. He dazzled. He shone. He won every prize the school could offer, and the admiration of every teacher who taught him, and a growing reputation that spread far beyond the castle walls. He corresponded with famous and learned wizards across the whole of the magical world, grown men and women who wrote to this brilliant boy as an equal, eager for his thoughts. He was, everyone agreed, destined for greatness. The world seemed to be opening before him like a door onto a wide and shining country, and he could feel it. And he longed for it with all the fierce impatience of a gifted young man who knows exactly how much he is capable of. And there, softly, is the sorrow woven through him, because all of that brightness was tied, by love and by duty and by blood, to a small hidden cottage in a quiet village, to a mother worn thin by secrecy, to a rough younger brother, and to a fragile sister who could never leave the house. Albus dreamed of the whole wide world. He dreamed of doing great things, of standing among the greatest minds of the age, of changing the very shape of the future. And every holiday he came home from the glittering possibility of it all, to the drawn curtains and the careful quiet of Godric's Hollow, to a family that could never be spoken of, that could never be shown, that would always need to be hidden and tended and kept. It is a hard thing to admit, and the story admits it gently on his behalf. He resented it. Not cruelly, not coldly, but in the way that a soaring young heart resents the weight that keeps it from soaring. He loved his family, of course he did, but he also felt them as a chain, a burden he had not chosen, a smallness closing around a life that wanted so badly to be large. He was ashamed of that feeling even as he felt it, which only made it heavier. And he waited, as the young do, for the day when his real life would finally begin, when his schooling would end and the wide world would take him up at last and carry him away to everything he was meant to be. That day seemed almost to have come. He finished his time at Hogwarts crowned with every honor, and a grand journey lay planned before him, a chance to travel and study alongside the brightest of his friends, to step out into the world he had dreamed of for so long. He could see it. He could nearly touch it. He was 18 years old, and the door was open, and he was about to walk through it into his whole shining future. And then, in a single afternoon, everything changed. For Ariana, by then, was a girl of about 14, and her storms had never truly stilled. And on one ordinary day, one of those sudden surges of the magic she could not control rose up in her, not out of any wish to harm, never that, only out of the wound that had never healed, and in that uncontrolled burst, something went terribly wrong. Kendra, her mother, who had spent so many years shielding her from every danger in the world, was caught by the very magic she had guarded so long. And she died suddenly, senselessly, by an accident no one could have stopped and no one could be blamed for, least of all the frightened girl who had never meant it, and who would have to live afterward with the not quite understanding of what had happened. You may feel the weight of that, and then, gently, let it pass. It was long ago. They are all at peace now, and you are only listening, warm and drowsy, held safe in the quiet of your own room. So Kendra was gone, and Albus, 18 years old, standing at the very threshold of the bright life he had waited for all his years, had to turn around and come home instead. There was no one else. His younger brother Aberforth was still in school, still a boy. Their father was long dead in his cold prison. There was only Albus now to take up the care of the household, to become the guardian of his fragile sister, who could not be left alone and could not be shown to the world, and the head of a family that had shrunk to a wound and a secret and a small, quiet cottage in Godric's Hollow. Imagine it, just for a moment, and then release it into the dark. The whole wide world had been open before him. Every door, every dream, every great and shining thing he had been so certain was his to reach. And now, in the space of a single grief, all of it had folded shut. His journey was cancelled. His future was set aside. Instead of the glittering company of the great, he had the drawn curtains and the silence and the endless, patient, unglamorous work of caring for a sister who needed watching every hour of every day. His grand dreams were chained all at once to a quiet cottage he could not leave, and he was angry. Grief-stricken, yes, and dutiful, and loving in his exhausted way, but also angry, restless, chafing against the smallness of it, mourning the vast life that had been so nearly his. His brother Aberforth, who loved Ariana with a simpler and steadier love, felt that anger in him and resented it, and between the two brothers a coldness began to grow, a quiet unspoken quarrel over who truly loved her and who was merely trapped by her. The house that summer was full of sorrow and unspoken things, two young men and a fragile girl, all bound together in a grief none of them knew how to carry. It was into that summer, that hot, restless, unhappy summer, with Albus trapped and brilliant and aching in the little village of Godric's Hollow, his enormous gifts with nowhere to go, and his heart full of a longing he could not act upon, that something new was about to arrive. For not far away, in that very same quiet village, another young man had just come to stay. A young man as brilliant as Albus himself, perhaps even more so. A young man with golden hair and a golden tongue, and a mind that burned as bright and hungry as Albus's own. A young man who would understand him as no one ever had, who would set his caged dreams alight, and who would lead him, in that fateful summer, toward wonders and toward a darkness that would shape the whole of the rest of his long life. But that meeting, and the friend who was about to change everything, belong to the part of the story that comes next. For now, let it rest. Let Albus stand there in the golden light of that summer, young and grieving and full of a fire he does not yet know where to spend. Let the village be quiet. Let the story pause here, gently, on the edge of the thing that is about to begin. There is nothing you need to do. There is nothing you need to remember. There is only the soft dark and the slow turning of a life long past, waiting patiently to carry you onward. And so the summer came to Godric's Hollow, that small and quiet village where the wizarding families lived close beside the Muggle ones, where the lanes were narrow and the hedgerows were heavy with green, and where a young man named Albus Dumbledore had come home to a life that felt like a cage. He was not yet 20. His mother was gone, laid to rest in the churchyard, and the future he had dreamed of had folded itself quietly shut. There had been a time, only a little while before, when Albus had stood at the very top of his world. He had been the most gifted student the school had seen in living memory, a boy whose name was known in every corner of the magical world before he had even left his classroom. Great men had written to him. Learned witches and wizards had sought his opinion. He had expected, without ever quite saying so aloud, to go out into the world and remake it, to travel and to study and to become something magnificent. Instead, he was here, in the house of his childhood, with the doors closed and the shutters half drawn, keeping watch over his sister. Her name was Ariana. She was the youngest of the 3 Dumbledore children, and she was not well, though the word the family used for it was never quite that word. Long ago, when she had been very small, something terrible had happened to her. A fright and a cruelty that had frightened her magic deep down inside her, where it could not come out gently anymore. And so it came out in other ways, sudden and frightened and sometimes dangerous, and she could not be left alone, and she could not be sent to school, and she could not be shown to the world. The family had hidden her, softly, lovingly, and with a great deal of quiet shame, and now that their mother was gone, the keeping of her fell to Albus. He loved her. You must hold on to that, through all of what follows. He loved his sister. But love and resentment can live in the same heart at the same time, side by side, each one ashamed of the other. And Albus in that summer was a young man whose enormous gifts had nowhere to go, and whose grief had nowhere to rest, and who felt, though he would have been ashamed to say it, that his own bright life had been traded away for a duty he had never chosen. His younger brother, Aberforth, did not feel this way at all. Aberforth was rougher, plainer, less clever with books and cleverer with living things, and he loved Ariana simply and completely, without ever counting the cost. He would have given the whole world for her, and thought nothing lost. He did not understand his brilliant older brother, and he did not especially want to. And between the 2 brothers, in that closed-up house, there was a silence made of things not said. It was into this village, into that heavy and grieving summer, that Gellert Grindelwald arrived. He had come to stay with his great-aunt, an elderly and kindly historian named Bathilda Bagshot, who lived only a little way along the lane and who had known the Dumbledore family for years. Gellert was near Albus's own age, and he had been sent away from his school abroad under a shadow, for he had done things there that the masters could not overlook, dangerous experiments, dangerous ideas, a mind that went too far and too fast for anyone to hold. But none of that showed on the surface. What showed on the surface was a young man who was beautiful and merry and blazing with life, with bright hair and a laughing mouth and eyes that seemed to look straight through the dull and ordinary crust of the world to the marvels hidden underneath. Bathilda, who was proud of her clever great-nephew and fond of her clever young neighbor, thought the two of them ought to meet. She could not have known what she was setting alight. They met, and it was, for Albus, like a door thrown suddenly open in a room he had thought had no doors at all. Here at last was someone who could keep pace with him. Here was a mind as quick as his own, as hungry, as unafraid, a mind that leaped where others crawled, that finished his sentences and then carried them further than he had dared to take them himself. For the first time in his life, Albus Dumbledore was not the cleverest person in the room, and he did not mind, because the other person in the room understood him. Do you know what that is like, to be understood after a long loneliness? It is like coming in out of the cold. It is like being given water after a long thirst. For a young man who had felt his brilliance turn to a burden, who had felt trapped and wasted and unseen, the arrival of Gellert Grindelwald was the most wonderful thing that had ever happened to him. And so that summer, they were together always. They walked the lanes of Godric's Hollow with their heads bent close in talk. They sat up through the short warm nights with candles guttering and books open all around them, arguing and dreaming and laughing until the birds began to sing. They wrote to each other, long letters, even though they lived only a few hundred yards apart, because there was always more to say than the day could hold, ideas that could not wait for morning. It was a friendship of a rare and burning kind, the kind that comes perhaps once in a lifetime and often never at all, and for Albus it was more than friendship. Let it be said gently, for it was a gentle and human thing. Albus loved him. He loved Gellert with the whole force of his young heart, with all the loneliness that had been building in him for years, and Gellert, who loved to be adored, let himself be loved and gave back enough to keep the fire high. Whether he ever truly loved Albus in return, no one can say for certain, and Albus himself would wonder about it for the rest of his long life. But in that summer, it did not seem to matter. In that summer, it felt like the beginning of everything. And here is where the sorrow begins to gather, softly, at the edges of the story. For their talk was not only the harmless talk of clever young men. Together they dreamed a dream, and the dream was dark, though neither of them could see the darkness in it then, because they had painted it over so brightly. It began with a legend, an old wizarding fairy tale about 3 brothers and 3 magical objects, 3 gifts said to have been given by Death himself, or won from him, long ago. A wand that could not be beaten in any duel, a stone that could call back those who had died, a cloak that could hide its wearer even from Death's own searching eyes. Together these 3 were called the Deathly Hallows, and the wizard who gathered all 3 and mastered them was said, in the old stories, to become the master of death. Most grown witches and wizards smiled at the tale and thought it only a story for children. But Gellert did not think it was only a story, and Albus, listening, found that he did not think so either. They began to search. They pored over old texts and older rumors. They traced the symbol of the Hallows through crumbling books. They believed, those 2 brilliant boys, that they could find what no one had ever found, and hold in their hands a power greater than any wizard had ever held, and the Hallows were only part of it. Around that glittering quest grew a larger dream, and it was this larger dream that would cast the longest shadow. For Gellert believed, and Albus came to believe with him, that the old order of the world was wrong. He believed that wizards, who were stronger and wiser, ought not to hide themselves away in fear of ordinary people. He believed that they ought to come out of the shadows and take their rightful place, that they ought to rule openly, and that the Muggle world ought to be led and ordered and governed by those with the power to do it. And they gave this idea a name, a soft and terrible name, a name that let them love it without seeing what it was. They called it the greater good. For the greater good, wizards would rise. For the greater good, the strong would guide the weak. For the greater good, there would be a new world, a bright new world, and they too would lead it, hand in hand, the young masters of a remade age. You must understand how it could happen, how a good and gifted young man could be swept into so dark a dream and feel, all the while, that he was reaching toward the light. Grief will do it. Loneliness will do it. Ambition, long caged and suddenly set loose, will do it. Albus was mourning his mother and chafing at his cage and dazzled by his friend, and Gellert made the dark idea feel like hope, made cruelty feel like courage, made domination feel like kindness. When you are unhappy, and someone brilliant and beautiful tells you that you are meant for greatness, that the ordinary rules are only for smaller souls, that all your pain has been the world failing to recognize you, it is a very easy thing to believe, because you want so badly for it to be true. Albus wanted it to be true. And so the darkness at the center of the dream was hidden from him by his own longing, and he did not look at it directly, and he let himself be happy. There was, of course, the matter of Ariana. There was always the matter of Ariana, waiting quietly in the house while her brother's mind flew off to remake the world. For the two young men meant to leave. That was the plan they had made in their bright and reckless certainty. They would go out together into the world to seek the Hallows and to raise their revolution, and they would not wait, and they would not be held back. But Albus could not simply go. He had a sister who could not be left, and who could not easily be taken along, and this was a stone in the road of the shining future, and Albus, to his lasting shame, began to treat it as an inconvenience rather than as his sister's life. He told himself there would be a way. He told himself she could travel with them, that they could care for her as they went. He was not thinking clearly. He was thinking with his longing, and his longing wanted to be free. And Aberforth saw it all, and Aberforth was not fooled for a moment. He saw his brilliant brother forget the sister at his feet for the sake of a beautiful stranger and a grand and dangerous scheme. He saw Ariana growing more unsettled, more frightened, as she always did when the household was troubled, as though she could feel the storm gathering even when no one spoke of it. He did not like Gellert. He did not trust him. He saw, with the plain, clear sight that clever people so often lack, that this laughing golden young man was leading his brother somewhere terrible, and that the whole grand dream was built upon leaving Ariana behind or dragging her along like baggage, and it made him furious, a slow, deep fury that at last could not be held in. And so it came, near the end of that summer, to the terrible evening. The three of them stood together in the small cottage, and Aberforth spoke his mind at last and said that Albus was not going anywhere, that Ariana could not be moved and would not be moved, that this was their sister and not a burden to be carried off on some mad adventure. And Gellert answered him, and the answer was cruel, and something in it was frightening, for Gellert did not like to be told no, and his temper, when it slipped, showed for an instant the thing that lay beneath all that beauty. And Albus, caught between the friend he loved and the brother he had wronged, caught between his dream and his duty, felt everything he had been holding back break loose at once. Tempers rose. Voices rose. And then wands were drawn. In that small room, 3 young men and their anger, and the air grew bright and dangerous. We will pass over the worst of it softly, as one draws a blanket over a sleeping child. There was a duel. Spells crossed the little room, too fast to follow, flashing and wild, and the 3 of them turned on one another in a confusion of grief and rage, and no one, afterward, could say clearly what had happened, because it had happened too quickly, in too small a space, with too much feeling. And Ariana, gentle, frightened Ariana, had come into the room, drawn perhaps by the noise, or by fear, or by the simple wish to make her brothers stop. And in the chaos, in the crossing of the spells, a curse went astray. No one meant it for her. No one surely could have meant it for her. But it found her all the same. And then, it was very quiet. She was 14 years old, and she was gone, and the 3 young men stood in the sudden silence and could not understand it, could not make it not be true. The dream ended there, in that little room, in that terrible hush. Everything that had blazed so brightly all summer went out at once, like a candle pinched between 2 fingers, and there was only the dark, and the smell of smoke, and a young girl lying still upon the floor of her own home. No one ever knew whose spell it was. That is the thing you must hold, the cruelest thing of all. In the wildness of that moment 3 wands had been firing, and the curse that struck her could have come from any of the 3, and there was no way, ever, to know. It might have been Gellert's, it might have been Aberforth's, and it might have been Albus's own. He would never be certain. For all the rest of his long life, through all his years and all his wisdom, that one question would sit in the deepest and most silent place of his heart, unanswered and unanswerable, and he would never fully believe that the hand had not been his. Perhaps it was not. Perhaps he tortured himself for nothing. But a man who has glimpsed the darkness in his own dreaming can never again be sure of his own innocence, and Albus had glimpsed it, and he could not unsee it. Gellert did not stay. When it was clear what had happened, when the enormity of it began to settle over the little house, he fled. He gathered himself, and he was gone, out of Godric's Hollow, out of England, away, and he did not look back. And the great friendship that had burned so hot all summer was over in an instant, turned in a single night from the most precious thing in Albus's life to a wound that would never wholly close. The dream of the Hallows, the dream of the greater good, the dream of 2 young masters remaking the world, all of it was ash now, blown away on the wind, and what was left behind was only grief, and a small grave to dig, and 2 brothers who could no longer look each other in the eye. They buried Ariana in the churchyard at Godric's Hollow, near their mother and father, and at her funeral the grief of the family broke at last into the open. Aberforth, wild with sorrow and with a rage that had every right to be, turned on his brother before the grave was even filled, and blamed him, and struck him, and broke his nose there among the mourners. And Albus did not raise his wand, and did not defend himself, and did not say a word, because in his heart he believed that he deserved it, and perhaps far worse besides. He let his brother strike him. It was the only thing he had left to give. And so the summer ended, and the golden boy who had expected to remake the world came out the other side of it, a different man. Everything he had thought about himself had been broken open. He had believed himself good and wise and destined for greatness, and he had learned instead that within him, coiled quietly all along, there had lived a hunger for power that had nearly cost the world its safety and had cost his sister her life. He had loved a man who would go on to become one of the darkest wizards the world would ever know, and he had loved the darkness in that man without ever naming it, because it had answered the darkness in himself. This was the knowledge Albus Dumbledore carried away from Godric's Hollow, and he would carry it every day for the rest of his life, and he would never set it down. But there is a strange mercy hidden in the deepest sorrows, and it was this. A lesser man, broken so, might have hardened, might have blamed the world, might have gone on reaching for power to fill the emptiness where his dream had been. Albus did the opposite. In his guilt and his humbling, he made a quiet and lifelong vow, not spoken aloud to anyone, but kept more faithfully than any oath. He resolved that he would never again trust himself with power, that he would fear his own ambition as another man fears fire, that whenever great authority came seeking him, as it would, again and again, he would gently turn it away. He had seen what he could become, and he had chosen, forever after, to become the other thing instead. And it was out of that ruin, out of that shame, carried softly, and never quite forgiven, that the wiser man began slowly to grow. The gentle and watchful and sorrowful old wizard the world would one day come to love, who understood the temptations of power so deeply precisely because he had once, long ago, in a bright and terrible summer, so very nearly given himself over to them. And so the years that followed Ariana's death were quiet ones, quieter than anything the young Albus had ever imagined for himself. For a long time he did not stray far from Godric's Hollow. He walked the same lanes he had walked as a boy, past the low stone wall and the little church, past the graves where his mother and his sister now lay side by side, and he carried within him a grief that did not shout and did not fade. It simply stayed, the way weather stays, the way the sea stays. He had dreamed once of remaking the world. He had dreamed of thrones and of banners, and of a new age in which the clever and the powerful would order all things for the good of everyone, or so he had told himself. And now those dreams lay in pieces on the floor of his childhood home, and a girl he had loved and neglected lay cold in the earth, and the friend with whom he had planned it all was gone, vanished into the wide world with fire in his heart. Albus had glimpsed something in himself that summer. He had felt how easily his own brilliance could turn to hunger, how sweetly power spoke to him, how readily he had let a bright and dangerous boy lead him toward cruelty in the name of a greater cause. And he had decided, in the long stillness afterward, that he would never trust himself with such a thing again. So he turned away from it. He turned away from ambition the way a man turns away from a cliff edge, slowly, carefully, with his eyes still upon the drop, knowing how near he had come. There were those who thought a wizard of his gifts belonged in the great halls of magical power, shaping laws, guiding nations, standing at the very front of things. But Albus had learned something about the front of things. He had learned what it cost and who paid the cost, and he wanted no more of it. Instead, he chose the smallest and the humblest of the paths open to him. He chose to teach. He returned to Hogwarts, the castle he had loved as a boy, the one place in all the world where he had ever felt truly at home. He came back not as a conqueror and not as a great man, but as a teacher of transfiguration, one master among many. And he settled into the rhythm of the school as though he had always belonged to it, which in a way he had, And here, in the classrooms and the corridors and the wide green grounds, something in Albus began, very slowly, to heal. Not to close over entirely, for some wounds never do, but to soften, to find a use, to find a kind of peace. He was by every account a marvelous teacher. Transfiguration is among the most difficult and most precise of all the magical arts. The turning of one thing into another, the reshaping of the very substance of the world, and it demands both great discipline and great imagination. Albus had both, in fuller measure than perhaps anyone alive, and he gave them freely to his students. He had a way of making the hardest ideas seem suddenly simple, of lighting a lamp in a young mind so that a student saw all at once what had been dark to them a moment before. He was patient with those who struggled and delighted by those who soared. He noticed the shy ones, the lonely ones, the ones who sat at the back and thought no one saw them, and he saw them. Every one. Children who had never been believed in found themselves believed in. Children who had thought themselves ordinary found in him a teacher who suspected they were not. And they loved him for it, generation after generation of them, in a way that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with kindness. For Albus had made kindness his discipline. The boy who had been so dazzled by his own cleverness had become a man who used his cleverness gently, who watched his own heart the way a careful gardener watches for frost. He wore bright robes, and he told odd jokes, and he kept an eye that twinkled behind his spectacles. And in all these small and gentle ways he made himself approachable, made himself safe, made himself the kind of man a frightened child might come to. It was a quiet sort of greatness, the greatness of a life spent in a school among children, and it was the greatness he had chosen on purpose, having tasted the other kind and found it bitter. And because he had chosen it on purpose, he held to it even when the world came calling. For the world did come calling, again and again across the long years of his life. As his reputation grew, so did the pressure upon him to leave the school and take up the highest offices in the wizarding world. More than once he was offered the post of Minister for Magic itself, the very summit of magical power in Britain, the seat from which he might have shaped the whole course of their society. Men of far less ability schemed and struggled their whole lives for a fraction of what was simply laid at Albus Dumbledore's feet. And every time it was offered, he refused it. He refused it gently, and he refused it firmly, and he refused it again the next time it was offered, and the time after that. Those who did not know him thought it strange. Here was the man best suited in all the land to lead, declining to lead, choosing instead to remain in a drafty castle marking essays and shepherding first years to their lessons. But Albus knew exactly why he refused. He had seen, that long ago summer, what he was capable of when power was placed within his reach. He had felt how it had woken something in him, something proud and cold and certain, something that had let a beloved sister slip toward death while he dreamed of grander things. He did not trust himself with power. He never would again. He had learned the hard, unforgettable lesson that he was safest, and the world was safest, when he stood a little apart from the levers of it. Better to be a teacher who could be trusted than a ruler who could not. Better to remain where he was loved and useful and small than to climb again toward the heights that had nearly undone him. And so he stayed at the school he loved, year upon year, and let others carry the weight of governing, and was, in his refusal, perhaps wiser than any minister who ever held the office. Yet even as he lived his quiet life, his fame grew, for it is difficult to hide a mind such as his, and Albus never tried to hide his work, only his ambition. In the long, unhurried hours between his teaching, he turned his attention to the deep mysteries of magic, and there he made discoveries that would carry his name across the world. He studied the properties of dragon's blood, that rare and powerful substance, and he uncovered its 12 uses, 12 secret virtues no wizard before him had ever named, and the discovery astonished the magical community and set his reputation soaring. It was the kind of achievement that alone would have made a lesser wizard famous for a lifetime, and for Albus it was merely one accomplishment among many. He turned, too, to alchemy, the oldest and most secretive of magical sciences, the art of transformation at its very deepest, and there he found a friend and a partner in the great alchemist Nicholas Flamel. Together the two of them labored over the mysteries of change and permanence, of gold and of life itself. And their collaboration became legendary, a meeting of two of the finest minds their world had known. Flamel was ancient beyond ordinary reckoning, the keeper of the only known philosopher's stone, that fabled object which could turn base metal into gold and produce the elixir of life, and Albus worked alongside him and learned from him and shared with him a lasting bond of respect and affection. It was work of quiet wonder, patient and slow, carried out far from the noise of the world, and it deepened still further the sense, among all who paid attention to such things, that Albus Dumbledore was no ordinary wizard. And so his reputation climbed and climbed, until at last it reached a height that few in all of history had ever reached. Wizards spoke his name with awe. They wrote of his discoveries in their books and taught of them in their schools. They sought his counsel and treasured his letters and repeated his sayings, slowly, without his ever seeking it, without his ever wanting it. The wizarding world arrived at a judgment that would follow him for the rest of his days, that Albus Dumbledore was the greatest wizard of the age, and perhaps the greatest wizard alive in all the world. He carried the honor lightly, as he carried everything, with a joke and a twinkle and a modest turning aside of praise. But the world had made up its mind about him, and it would not be moved. Yet even in these bright and busy years, a shadow lay across the far edge of Albus's life, and its name was Grindelwald. For while Albus had turned away from the dream they had shared, Gellert had not. The brilliant, beautiful, dangerous boy who had once sat with Albus in the summer sun spinning visions of a new world had gone out into that world and begun, in terrible earnest, to make his visions real. He grew in power year upon year. He gathered followers to himself, drawing them with the same golden persuasion that had once so dazzled Albus, and he turned that gift toward conquest. He raised an army. He rose across the continent of Europe like a slow and gathering storm, and the things he had once spoken of as bright ideals became, in practice, cruelty and terror and death. For the good of the greater number, he said, and in the name of that phrase he broke the world. He became, in time, the most dangerous dark wizard the world had ever known, the darkest it had seen in living memory and long before. For years he terrorized wizardkind across Europe. Nations fell into fear of him. Whole populations lived beneath the shadow of his name, and the horror of it spread and spread. And always, always, there was one wizard whom everyone believed could stop him. One wizard whose power was said to equal or surpass his own. One wizard who had known him better than any living soul. And that wizard did nothing. That wizard stayed at his school and taught his lessons and made his discoveries and would not go. It was the great secret shame of those years, though few knew the reason, and fewer still guessed the depth of it. For the truth was that Albus was afraid. Not afraid of Grindelwald's power, though it was vast. He was afraid of Grindelwald himself, of facing him, of standing before the man he had loved and lost and betrayed. And more than that, far more than that, he was afraid of what he might learn if they ever met again. For on that terrible night in Godric's Hollow, when 3 wands had flashed in a darkened room, and Ariana had fallen dead among them, no one had ever known whose curse had struck her. It might have been Grindelwald's. It might have been Aberforth's. It might have been Albus's own. He did not know, and he could not bear to know, and he understood that if he ever faced Gellert again, that question might at last be answered, and the answer might be one he could not survive. And so, out of fear, and out of grief, and out of a love that had never fully died, he delayed. He delayed while cities burned. He delayed while the death toll rose. He delayed for years, and hated himself for the delaying, and delayed still. But there are some duties that cannot be put off forever, and at last the day came when Albus could delay no longer. In the year 1945, when the shadow of Grindelwald had spread as far as it would ever spread, and when the world could bear no more, Albus Dumbledore set down at last the burden of his own reluctance and went to face him. And what happened between them has passed into legend, spoken of ever after in hushed and reverent tones, remembered as the greatest duel in the whole history of magic. We do not know all of it, and perhaps it is better so, for some things are too great and too sorrowful to be fully told. But those who tell of it tell of magic such as had never been seen before, and has never been seen since. 2 of the most powerful wizards who ever lived turning the full force of their genius against one another, the air itself alive with fire and light. Spells woven and unwoven faster than the eye could follow, the very stones trembling with the weight of what passed between them. And through it all there was the strange and terrible sorrow underneath, that these 2 had once been friends, had once been more than friends, had once sat together and dreamed a golden dream, and now stood as enemies at the ending of it, each pouring his whole heart into the undoing of the other. It was a battle of power, yes, but it was also, and more deeply, the last conversation of a love that had gone terribly wrong, spoken in the only language left to them. And in the end, Albus won. However it happened, and it must have cost him more than anyone will ever know, he overcame Gellert Grindelwald. He defeated the darkest wizard in the world, and he broke his power, and he brought his long reign of terror to its close. Grindelwald was taken and imprisoned, shut away in a high and lonely cell at the very top of the fortress he himself had built, the prison called Nurmengard, and there he would remain for the rest of his long life, a fallen thing, a warning, a memory. The world breathed again, the shadow lifted, and the wizarding community, which had already thought Albus the greatest wizard alive, now had the proof of it, for he had done what no one else could do, and he had done it at last. But there was one thing about that duel that Albus told to almost no one, a secret he carried quietly for the rest of his days. For Grindelwald, in his years of conquest, had come to wield a wand unlike any other in the world. It was the Elder Wand, the Death Stick, the most powerful wand ever made, a wand of legend, a wand said to guarantee victory to whoever mastered it. And it was more than merely powerful. It was one of the 3 Deathly Hallows, one of the 3 fabled objects of death that Albus and Gellert had dreamed of together in their youth, had sought together, had believed would make them the masters of death itself. And now, In the moment of Albus's victory, that wand passed to him. By defeating Gellert, Albus won the Elder Wand's allegiance, and it became his, and he became its master. There was a heavy and a bitter irony in it, one that Albus felt keenly and spoke of to no one. For here was the very thing he had once craved, the object of his youthful dark dream. The prize he and the boy he loved had schemed to find so that together they might rule. He had turned away from that dream. He had spent his whole long life refusing power, refusing office, refusing every crown the world tried to press upon him, precisely because he did not trust himself to hold it. And now the most powerful magical object in all the world had come into his keeping anyway, not sought, not desired, but won, and won from the hands of the friend he had loved and lost, in the very act of destroying him. He kept it. He used it, quietly, for good, as an ordinary wand, letting almost no one guess what it truly was. And he carried the weight of it, the strange, dark weight of a dream that had come true in the saddest way it possibly could, alone, as he carried so many things. So the man who had begun in ambition ended in humility, and the boy who had reached for power became the wizard who was trusted precisely because he would not reach for it again. Honors were heaped upon him now beyond counting. He was made the head of great councils, the chief of the wizards' high court, the leader of their international confederations, and yet still the office he held closest to his heart was the smallest one, his place within the walls of Hogwarts. And in time the school gave him the only crown he had ever truly wanted. Albus Dumbledore was made Headmaster of Hogwarts, master of the castle he had loved since he was a boy, keeper of its towers and its secrets, guardian of every child who passed beneath its doors. It was, for him, a homecoming, and it was there, in that beloved and ancient place, that he would spend the long remaining years of his life. But the wizarding world does not stay at peace for long, and even as one darkness fell into its prison in the high cold north, another was already stirring, quieter for now, and closer to home. For a boy had been born who would one day become something worse than Grindelwald had ever been, and a prophecy would one day be spoken in a dim back room that would bind that boy's fate to another's. And Albus, revered now across the whole of the magical world, would find that his life's greatest labor was still before him, and that all he had learned of loss and love and the terrible cost of power would be needed, at the last, for the darkness that was yet to come. The night the orphanage stood gray and quiet, years before any of this, Albus Dumbledore had climbed a narrow staircase to meet a boy no one there quite loved. Let the body grow heavy as you listen, and let the years fold softly over one another, for the story of Albus Dumbledore now becomes the story of a long, patient war, and of the man who stood at its center without ever raising his voice too loud. By the time he became Headmaster of Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore had already lived several lifetimes of grief and glory, and he wore them lightly, the way an old tree wears its rings. He walked the castle corridors in robes of deep blue and violet, sometimes embroidered with stars and moons, and his long silver hair and longer silver beard could be tucked into his belt when the wind rose. His eyes were a pale, bright blue, and they twinkled behind half-moon spectacles, so that even when he said nothing at all, you had the feeling he was quietly delighted by the world, and quietly delighted by you. He had a crooked nose, broken once long ago, and long deft fingers, and a voice that never needed to be raised to be obeyed. Children who came to Hogwarts frightened found, almost at once, that the great and famous Dumbledore was gentle. He learned their names. He noticed the small ones who sat alone. He offered lemon drops, those little muggle sweets he loved, holding out the bag as though sharing a great secret. And he made odd remarks that no one entirely understood, about socks, or about music, or about the curious pleasures of growing very old. Beneath that warmth, though, there was a mind that never truly rested. He was, everyone agreed, the greatest wizard of the age. He had defeated a dark wizard called Grindelwald in a duel the whole world still whispered about. He had done famous work with the properties of dragon's blood, and he wrote letters to alchemists and scholars, and he understood magic more deeply than any living soul. Ministers of magic came to him for advice, and more than once begged him to take the highest office in the land, and every time he refused, for he did not trust himself with that kind of power, not after what power had once cost him. So he stayed at Hogwarts, among the children, and the whole wizarding world leaned on him without quite realizing how much. He was the one figure everyone believed could keep the darkness out. He was the safe center of a world that did not yet know how frightened it should be. And in the quiet of his study, high in a tower, surrounded by whirring silver instruments and portraits of sleeping headmasters, Dumbledore watched and remembered and waited. For he alone carried a memory that troubled him more than he ever let show. He alone remembered a small boy in a gray orphanage, and the cold thing he had felt uncoil in that room, long ago. Let yourself sink a little deeper now, and go back with him to that room. It had been a plain London orphanage run by tired women on an ordinary gray afternoon. Dumbledore had come, as he came for every muggle-born or orphaned child of magic, to tell a boy that he was a wizard and to bring him to Hogwarts. But this boy was not like the others. His name was Tom Riddle. He was handsome even then, dark-haired and pale and neat, and he was clever in a way that made the grown-ups uneasy without knowing why. The other children at the orphanage were afraid of him. Strange things happened around Tom, cruel things, and he had learned already to enjoy the fear he caused. When Dumbledore told him what he was, the boy did not weep with wonder, as most did. He grew hungry. He wanted to know how to use it. He spoke of making things happen, of making people hurt, of the animals he could control and the children he could frighten. And he asked, with a strange bright greed, whether magic could make him special, whether it could make him powerful, whether it could set him above everyone else forever. Dumbledore listened and said little, and felt something turn cold inside him. He did not condemn the boy. He never did. He offered him a place at Hogwarts, as he would offer any child, and he told him firmly that at the school there were rules, and that cruelty would not be permitted. But he left that gray room already watchful, already certain that here was a child who would need watching all his life. And so, from the very first, one man in all the world was never fooled by Tom Riddle. Not the charm, not the brilliance, not the perfect manners that would win over every other teacher in the years to come. Dumbledore saw the hollow underneath, and he never once looked away. Feel how heavy your eyes have grown, and let the years pass gently now, the way years do in a story told softly in the dark. At Hogwarts, Tom Riddle became everything a school could wish for, and nothing a heart could love. He was brilliant. He won prizes and praise. He was made a prefect, then head boy. Teachers adored him, and those who did not adore him were careful never to say so. But behind the polished face, he was gathering knowledge no boy should want, delving into the darkest corners of magic, searching for ways to escape the one thing he feared above all others, which was death. He gathered followers, too, a circle of admirers who would one day become something far worse. And piece by terrible piece, Tom Riddle unmade himself, tearing his own soul and hiding the fragments away, until the brilliant boy was gone and something else wore his shape. He shed his name as a snake sheds skin and took a new one, a name that would come to mean terror across a whole country. He became Lord Voldemort, and in time so many grew so afraid of that name that they would not speak it at all, and called him only you-know-who, or he who must not be named, as though the very sound of it might call him to the door. Only Dumbledore went on speaking the name plainly, calmly, the way you speak of a thing you refuse to fear. And only Dumbledore, perhaps, still remembered the small boy in the orphanage inside the monster, and grieved a little for what might have been, even as he prepared to stand against what was. The darkness came slowly, and then, all at once, Voldemort gathered his followers, the Death Eaters, wizards who wore masks and hoods and did his cruel work in the night. They believed in the pure and the powerful, and they despised those born of Muggle families, and they killed and tortured and vanished people from their beds, until fear lay over the whole wizarding world like a fog that never lifted. Families disappeared. Friends turned upon friends. No one knew who could be trusted. People spoke in whispers even in their own kitchens. It was a war, though it did not look like the wars of old, for it was fought in shadows and in secrets, and its front line ran through every ordinary home. This was the first Wizarding War, and for a long time it seemed as though the darkness might simply win, might spread, until there was nothing left that it had not touched. But there was one man Voldemort could not sweep aside. There was one man he feared. Dumbledore did not run, and he did not hide, and he did not bargain. Instead, he gathered the brave to him, quietly, one by one, and he founded a secret society to stand against the Dark Lord. They called it the Order of the Phoenix, after the bird that burns and is reborn from its own ashes, the bird whose very nature is to rise again from ruin. The order was small, and it had no great power behind it, only courage and loyalty and the willingness to risk everything. They met in secret. They fought where they could. They lost friends again and again, and buried them, and went on. And through it all, at the head of them, stood the old headmaster with the twinkling eyes, the one wizard the Dark Lord himself would not face directly. The one name that made even Voldemort pause. For all his terrible power, Voldemort knew that Dumbledore was the greater wizard, and so he schemed around him, and waited, and never quite dared to meet him while the war still hung in the balance. Let your breath slow now, in and out, soft and even, and let the story carry you gently toward the strange turning that changed everything. It came, as such things sometimes do, in the form of a few whispered words. There was a prophecy. It was spoken by a seer in the dim upstairs room of an inn, on a cold night, in a voice not quite her own, and it foretold the coming of a child who would have the power to defeat the Dark Lord. A boy born as the 7th month died, born to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times. A child marked as the Dark Lord's equal, with power the Dark Lord knew not. One would have to die at the hand of the other, the prophecy said, for neither could truly live while the other survived. Dumbledore heard those words spoken, and understood at once how dangerous they were, how much they must never be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. But part of them already had, for a servant of Voldemort had been lurking outside that door in the dark and had heard the beginning of the prophecy before he was discovered and thrown out. He carried what he had heard back to his master, only a fragment, only enough to be terribly dangerous and not enough to be understood. And so the Dark Lord came to believe that somewhere a child was being born who could destroy him, and being what he was, he did not pause to wonder or to doubt. He decided that the child must die. There were 2 boys the prophecy might have meant, but Voldemort chose one. He chose the son of James and Lily Potter, a baby named Harry, and in choosing him he marked him, though he did not yet know all that his choosing would mean. The Potters went into hiding, for they were members of the Order, and Dumbledore did everything in his power to keep them safe, to hide them behind the oldest and most secret of protections. But they were betrayed. On a night at the very end of October, in a small house in a village called Godric's Hollow, Lord Voldemort came for the child. He killed James Potter first, who stood between the Dark Lord and the stairs with no wand in his hand, buying his family a few last seconds. Then he came for the room where Lily stood over the baby's cot. He told her to step aside. He would have let her live, this once, for reasons of his own. But she would not move. She begged him to take her instead, to spare the child, to kill her and let her son live, and when he would not, she stood her ground and died there, her arms flung wide before the cot, giving her life for her babies without a wand, without a spell, with nothing but love. And that, in the end, was a kind of magic older and deeper than anything Voldemort understood. When he turned his wand upon the child and spoke the words that had ended so many lives, the curse did not touch the boy as it should have. Lily's death had laid a protection over her son that no dark magic could break, a shield woven of pure love, and the curse rebounded. It struck the Dark Lord instead. His body was destroyed. The thing that had been Tom Riddle was torn from the world, ripped loose and left as less than a ghost, less than the meanest spirit, unable to die and unable truly to live. He fled, broken, into the wild places of the earth. And in the ruined house, in the cot, the baby lived, with nothing to show for that terrible night but a thin scar upon his forehead, shaped like a bolt of lightning. The war was over, or seemed to be. Across the whole wizarding world, people who had lived in fear for years came out into the open and wept and celebrated, and they did not know why the terror had lifted, only that it had. And they spoke, in wonder, of a baby who had lived. They called him the boy who lived. But the old headmaster, when the news reached him, did not celebrate. He grieved for James and Lily, and he understood, better than anyone, that what had happened was not an ending. It was only a pause. For Dumbledore knew things about Voldemort that no one else knew, and he did not believe, not for one moment, that the Dark Lord was truly and finally gone. Let yourself grow heavier still, and stay with the old man a little longer, for in these same days another soul came to him broken, and what passed between them was one of the great secret sorrows of his life. There was a man named Severus Snape. He had been a follower of Voldemort, a Death Eater, clever and bitter and hungry to belong. But long before that, when he was only a poor and lonely boy, he had loved a girl with dark red hair and kind green eyes, and her name was Lily. He had loved her all his life, in his twisted and unhappy way, even after she turned from him, even after she married another man. And it was Snape who had carried that fragment of the prophecy to Voldemort, not knowing, not dreaming, that in doing so, he was handing the woman he loved to her death. When he understood at last that his master meant to kill Lily and her family, something in him broke that never truly mended. He went to Dumbledore. On a wild, dark hillside, in terror and despair, Severus Snape begged the one man who might be able to save her. He offered anything, everything, if only Lily could be spared. And Dumbledore, who missed very little, saw the depth of the man's anguish and asked what he would give in return. But it was already too late for Lily. She died, as you know, and when Snape learned of it, his grief was a terrible thing to see, a grief so raw that Dumbledore, who had known so much loss himself, was moved by it. And here is the thing that only a man like Dumbledore could have done. He did not turn Snape away, though Snape had helped to doom the Potters. He did not punish him. Instead, gently and terribly, he took hold of that vast and hopeless remorse, and he asked whether Snape might honor the woman he had loved by protecting the one piece of her that remained in the world, her son. The boy had her eyes, and so Severus Snape swore, on that hillside and ever after, to protect Harry Potter, always, in secret, at any cost, for the sake of a love that had never once been returned. Dumbledore took a haunted, guilty man and made of him the bravest and most secret servant of the light, a double agent who would one day walk again among the Death Eaters wearing the mask of an enemy, carrying his true heart hidden so deep that almost no one would ever guess it was there. Two men bound together now by guilt and grief and a fragile, unshakable trust, each carrying a sorrow the world could not see. It was one of the strangest and most tender alliances of Dumbledore's long life, and one of the most important, and he kept it secret faithfully for years and years. And there remained one more thing to do. The smallest thing, and in its way, the hardest. There was the baby to consider. There was Harry. Feel the quiet settle over you now, the deep quiet of a night's work nearly done, as the old man makes his last choice in this chapter of the story. Harry Potter had no parents left, but he had, far away in an ordinary suburb, an aunt and an uncle and a cousin, his mother's sister and her family, the only blood relatives he had in all the world. They were Muggles, and they were not kind, and Dumbledore knew it. They would not love the boy as he deserved to be loved. They would give him no warmth, no wonder, no gentle words at bedtime, and yet Dumbledore chose them, and he chose them for a reason that was itself a kind of magic. Lily's sacrifice had left its protection in Harry's very blood, and that protection could be renewed and made strong only in a home where his mother's blood also lived. Under his aunt's roof, sealed by that ancient bond, Harry would be safe from Voldemort and his followers in a way no fortress could ever make him. It was a hard choice, and a cold one to look at from the outside, and Dumbledore did not make it lightly. He made it with a heavy heart and open eyes, weighing years of small unhappiness against the boy's very life, and choosing life. It was love, in the end, doing arithmetic in the dark. And so, on a still November night, the old headmaster came quietly to a street of identical houses and put out every lamp along it with a small silver device and stood in the pooling dark. A great gamekeeper brought the sleeping baby down from the sky on a flying motorcycle, and a stern witch who had been watching the house all day in the shape of a cat resumed her own form to grieve beside him. Together they laid the child upon a doorstep, wrapped warm in his blankets, with a letter tucked in beside him, explaining all that could be explained. Dumbledore looked down at the little sleeping face, at the strange thin scar, and something in his eyes was very bright. He murmured a blessing over the boy, soft as a breath. "Good luck," he told him. And then he turned, and the lamps came back on one by one, and he walked away into the night and left the child to sleep. He did not forget him. He never forgot him. In the years that followed, while Harry grew up small and unloved in the cupboard under a staircase, never knowing who he was or what he had done, the old headmaster watched from a distance, quietly, patiently, as he watched over so many things. He knew the boy must have this ordinary, difficult childhood, hidden and safe and far from fame, until he was old enough to come to Hogwarts and learn, slowly, gently, the truth of himself. And Dumbledore waited. He tended the school and kept its secrets, and spoke Voldemort's name aloud when others flinched, and beneath the twinkling calm he never once let go of what he knew in his bones to be true, that the Dark Lord was not dead, only waiting, and that one day, when the boy was grown, the danger would come creeping back, and the long quiet would end. So the years turned, and the seasons passed over the little suburban street and over the far turrets of the castle, and a boy who did not know he was a wizard grew slowly toward the day the letters would come for him, and the old man in the tower kept his long and loving watch and waited for the story to begin again. And so the years turned, as they always do, slow and certain, like the pages of a book that no one is in any hurry to finish. The boy grew in a house that did not love him, in a cupboard beneath the stairs, and far away, in a castle full of moving staircases and candlelight, an old man waited. Albus Dumbledore did not visit. He did not write. He did not appear at the window on winter nights to see how the child was faring. He only waited, and he watched from a distance so great that it must sometimes have felt like no watching at all. He knew that Harry was safe, because he had made him safe with old and quiet magic, and he told himself that safety was enough, that safety was the kindest gift he could give. And still, on certain evenings, when the great hall had emptied and the fires had burned low, the old man would sit alone and think of a small boy in a small house, growing up unloved, and he would feel the weight of what he had chosen settle over him like a heavy cloak. Then came the year that Harry turned 11, and the letters began to fly. You may imagine them, those hundreds of letters, pouring down the chimney and slipping under the door, refusing to be stopped, and behind every one of them stood the will of an old man who had waited a long, long time. He wanted the boy to come to Hogwarts. He wanted him to walk beneath the same enchanted ceiling that Harry's mother and father had walked beneath, to sleep in the same towers, to learn the same spells, to find, at last, a place where he belonged. And when Harry finally came, when the small boy with his mother's eyes stepped through the great doors and into the light, Dumbledore watched him from the high table, and something in the old man's chest ached with a tenderness he could not show and dared not speak. For this was the shape of Dumbledore's love all through those Hogwarts years. It was a love that kept its distance. It was a love that watched from the far end of a long table, that smiled a small smile beneath a long silver beard, that offered a kind word now and then withdrew again into silence. He could not be close to Harry. He would not let himself be. Partly this was caution, for a headmaster cannot show favor to one child above all the others, and partly it was strategy, for there were eyes upon them both, and secrets that must not be guessed. But mostly, if the old man was honest with himself in the quiet of his own heart, it was fear. He was afraid of what closeness would reveal. He was afraid of what it would cost, for the boy and for himself. He had learned, long ago and at a terrible price, that the people Albus Dumbledore loved had a way of coming to grief. And so he loved Harry the only way he trusted himself to love anymore, which was carefully and from far away, and with a sorrow he never let show. Yet there were moments, small and precious, when the distance closed. There was the way the old man's eyes would twinkle across the hall when Harry did something brave or good. There were the words of encouragement, dropped like coins into the boy's hands at just the right moment. There was the sense, which Harry felt without ever being able to name it, that somewhere in that vast castle there was one old man who saw him, truly saw him, and thought him worth the seeing. These were the grandfatherly moments, gentle and few, and Dumbledore hoarded them the way a poor man hoards small treasures, because he knew that he could not allow himself many more. It was in that first winter that Harry found the mirror. You will remember it, perhaps, the great mirror standing in a forgotten room, tall as the ceiling, framed in gold, with words carved along its top that read backward and meant, when you unraveled them, that it showed not your face, but the deepest desire of your heart. Harry found it, and in it he saw his family, his mother and his father and all the kin he had never known, standing behind him and smiling, and he could not tear himself away. Night after night he returned, and stood before the glass, and drowned himself in the sight of the dead who could not come back. And it was there, in the dark, that the old man found him. Dumbledore did not scold. He did not send the boy away with a sharp word. He only sat with him in the quiet and spoke to him, softly, of what the mirror was and what it did. He told him that it showed us nothing more or less than the deepest, most desperate desire of our hearts, and that the happiest man alive would look into it and see only himself, exactly as he was. He told him that men had wasted away before that glass, entranced by what they saw, not knowing whether it was real or even possible. He told him, gently, that it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live. Harry did not know, could not have known, what those words cost the old man to speak. For Dumbledore, too, had his mirror. Dumbledore, too, knew what it was to stand before a vision of the dead and long for what could not be. When Harry asked him what he himself would see in the glass, the old man paused, and then he said, lightly, that he saw himself holding a pair of thick woolen socks. It was a small joke, a kind lie, offered to a child so that the child would not carry the old man's sorrow along with his own. For the truth was that Dumbledore would have seen his family whole again. He would have seen his mother alive, and his sister well and laughing, and his brother's face turned toward him without blame. He would have seen the ones he had lost through his own pride and his own carelessness, all those long years ago, restored to him, and he would have known that vision for the impossible thing it was, and it would have broken him. So he spoke of socks, and he warned the boy away from the glass, and only he knew that the warning was one he had learned to give himself, over and over, across a lifetime of grief. That was the shape of the man who watched over Harry, wise and sad, and carrying a sorrow he would not lay upon a child. And the years went on, and a pattern began to form, a pattern that Dumbledore came to know and to dread. For the enemy did not stay away. Voldemort, who was supposed to be gone, who was whispered to be dead, came back, again and again, in one form, and then another. First it was the shadow of him clinging to the back of another man's head, reaching for a stone that could grant eternal life. Then it was a memory of him, 16 years old, and beautiful and cruel, poured into a diary and loosed upon the school. opening a hidden chamber and setting an old monster free. Then, at last, it was the thing itself, risen in a dark graveyard from a cauldron, given hands and a face and a body once more. Time and again the enemy returned, and time and again it was Harry who stood in his path. A boy, only a boy, facing a horror that had made grown wizards tremble. And what did the old man do, in all those years, while the boy he loved walked again and again into danger? He watched. That is the hard truth of it, and Dumbledore knew it was hard, and he never forgave himself for it entirely. He watched. He stepped in when he must, at the very edge of ruin, when there was no other choice, and he pulled the boy back from the brink. But often, more often than his heart could bear, he let Harry go forward. He let him face the trials. He let him be afraid, and hurt, and tested almost past his strength, and he did not intervene, because he knew something that he could not yet say. He knew, from a prophecy spoken long ago, what this boy would one day have to become. He knew what Harry would one day have to face, and to do, and to endure, and he understood, with a cold and aching clarity, that a boy who was sheltered from every danger would never grow into the man who could meet the last and greatest danger of all. So he let him grow the hard way. He let the fire temper him. And every trial that made Harry stronger made the old man's guilt heavier, for he was, in his own eyes, a shepherd raising a lamb toward a slaughter he could not yet name. This was the secret that Dumbledore carried through all those years, and it was a secret that weighed more than any crown. He knew that the bond between Harry and Voldemort was not the simple thing it appeared to be. He knew it went deeper and darker than anyone living could guess. He knew that on the night Voldemort had failed to kill the child, something had passed between them, some fragment of the enemy's own torn and ruined soul, and that it had lodged itself inside the boy and made him more than a survivor. It had made him, though neither of them knew it, something like a vessel. Dumbledore alone suspected this. Dumbledore alone understood, as the years passed and the pieces of the puzzle came together in his old and careful mind, what it would one day mean. And what it would mean was terrible. What it would mean was that the boy he loved might have to face not only Voldemort's wand but Voldemort's death, and might have to walk toward it willingly, and might not walk back. Imagine carrying such a knowledge. Imagine loving a child, watching him laugh over breakfast, watching him grow tall and brave and good, watching him make friends and learn to fly and score goals in the golden autumn air, and knowing all the while what waited for him at the end of the road. Imagine trying, with every scrap of tenderness you could summon, to steal for that child a little happiness, a little ordinary boyhood, a few years of feasts and games and friendship, while you were also, slowly and deliberately, and with a broken heart, preparing him for a destiny that might destroy him. That was Dumbledore's burden. He loved Harry, and he was using Harry, and both of these things were true at once, and he never found a way to make them stop being true. He tried to give the boy a childhood. He tried to let him be happy, and underneath the kindness, always, ran the cold current of what must be done. The old man lived in that tension for years, and it aged him in ways that had nothing to do with the passing of time. Then came the night in the graveyard, and everything changed. Voldemort returned to a body of his own, whole and terrible, and the thing that Dumbledore had feared and expected and dreaded for 13 long years came to pass. The Dark Lord walked the earth again, and Dumbledore did not hesitate. That very night, even as the school buzzed with rumor and disbelief, the old man began to move. He called back the ones he trusted. He summoned the scattered members of an old fellowship, the Order of the Phoenix, the secret company that had fought the First War and paid for it in blood. He gathered them again, the loyal and the brave and the grieving, and he set them to their watch, and quietly, in the shadows, the Second War began. But the world did not want to hear it. That was the bitterest part. The Ministry of Magic, comfortable in its towers, could not bear the truth that Dumbledore spoke, and so it chose not to believe him. It called him a liar. It called him an old man gone foolish, an old man clinging to fear, an old man hungry for attention and power. It stripped him of his honors and mocked him in its newspapers, and sent its people into his own school to watch him and undermine him. For a whole long year, Albus Dumbledore stood nearly alone, disgraced in the eyes of the very world he was trying to save, and he let it happen. He could have made peace. He could have softened his words, could have let the comfortable lie stand, could have kept his titles and his good name. But he would not. He had chosen truth over comfort, and he paid the price of that choice with his reputation, and very nearly with his place, and he never once complained of it. For he had learned, across a long life, that the truth is a beautiful and a terrible thing, and must be treated with great caution, and must never, ever be traded away for one's own ease. And in the strangest way, in that hardest of years, something between the old man and the boy at last began to change. For years, Dumbledore had kept his distance. For years, he had watched Harry from far away and told himself it was for the boy's own good. But the distance had done its own quiet harm. It had left Harry alone with burdens too great for him, and it had left the old man alone with a guilt that grew heavier every day. And slowly, haltingly, Dumbledore began to close the gap. He began to tell Harry more. He began to trust him with pieces of the truth, to share with him the shape of the war they were fighting, to speak to him not as a headmaster speaks to a pupil, but as one soldier speaks to another, or as a grandfather at last speaks to the grandson he has loved in silence for so long. The old man and the boy were drawn together by the thing they shared, which was a lonely and a heavy burden that no one else could fully understand. Voldemort had marked them both. Voldemort had taken from them both. And in the drawing close of those two lonely souls there was a kind of tender mercy, hard won and long delayed. Dumbledore knew, by then, how much he had wronged the boy by keeping him at arm's length. He said as much, in the end, or came near to saying it. He confessed that his care for Harry, his fierce desire to protect him from pain, had led him into an error, for in trying to spare the boy suffering, he had only prepared a greater suffering for later. He had loved Harry too much to tell him the truth, and so he had told him too little, too late. It was an old man's failing, born of an old man's tenderness, and Dumbledore saw it clearly at last, and grieved over it, and tried, in the time that remained, to make it right. He drew the boy closer. He began to teach him not only spells, but secrets. He began to hand him, piece by piece, the terrible inheritance that would one day be his to carry alone. For the old man was changing now in another way, too, a way that no potion could mend, and no spell could turn back. He was growing old, truly old, and something more than age had begun to weaken him. There was a shadow on him, a slow and creeping harm, though he hid it well and spoke of it to no one. His hand had blackened, and the darkness in it was spreading, and he knew, with the calm that comes to those who have long expected the end, that his time was running short. He did not fear it. He had made his peace with death long ago, had come to think of it, in his gentle way, as nothing more than the next great adventure, a friend waiting patiently at the close of a long and well-worn day. But he knew that he had work to finish before that friend arrived, and that the work was greater and darker than anything he had yet asked of himself or of the boy. For Dumbledore had come, at last, to understand the whole of the terrible truth. He had understood why Voldemort had not truly died on that long-ago night, why he had clung to a shred of unnatural life, why he had come crawling back again and again out of the dark. He had understood that the enemy had done something to himself, something monstrous and forbidden, something that split the soul and scattered it and anchored it to the world in hidden and guarded pieces. And he had understood that as long as those pieces remained, Voldemort could not truly die, and the war could not truly be won, and the boy he loved could never truly be free. So the old man turned, in what he knew to be his final year, to the work that would consume the last of his strength and the last of his days. He set himself to the hunt, quietly, patiently, gathering old memories and following faint and fading trails through the long history of his enemy's life. Albus Dumbledore bent his failing body and his still brilliant mind toward the finding and the breaking of those scattered fragments of a shattered soul. And into that dark and final labor, he would draw the boy at last, all the way in, and together they would go looking for the pieces of Voldemort that were hidden across the wide and sleeping world. The great secret came to Dumbledore slowly, the way the truth of a dark thing so often does, gathering itself out of small clues and stray remarks, and the quiet dread of a mind that had learned, long ago, to fear what it half suspected. For years he had wondered how a man could return from a body that had been destroyed. He had watched Voldemort fall, once, on a night in Godric's Hollow, and he had never quite believed that the danger had ended there. Others had called it a miracle, or a mercy, or simply the end of a nightmare. Dumbledore had called it nothing at all, at least not aloud, and had begun, very quietly, to think. And thinking, for Dumbledore, was never an idle thing. It was a slow and patient labor, and he gave himself to it fully in those last years. In the long evenings when the castle had gone to sleep and the fire in his office had burned low. What he found, when at last he found it, was a horror older than most wizards ever dared to name. There is a kind of magic so dark that the books which describe it are locked away, or burned, or simply forgotten on purpose, because to know of it is already to be marked by it. It is called the making of a Horcrux, and it is the darkest deed a soul can do. For to make a Horcrux, a wizard must first tear his own soul apart. He must commit the worst of all crimes, the taking of another life, and in that act of murder the soul splits, ripped along a seam that was never meant to part. And then, by an art too terrible to speak plainly, the torn piece is sealed away inside an object, hidden somewhere in the world, so that even if the body dies, that fragment of soul remains, anchored to the earth, unable to pass on. And so long as that fragment endures, its maker cannot truly die. He is chained to life, broken and diminished, but deathless. This was Voldemort's secret. Dumbledore understood it at last, and understanding it, he felt not triumph but a heavy and settling sorrow. For Voldemort had not made one Horcrux only. He had done the thing again and again, splitting his soul not once but many times, tearing himself into pieces as though his own wholeness meant nothing to him, as though he would rather be a shattered and scattered thing that could not die than a whole man who someday must. 7 pieces, Dumbledore came to believe. A soul divided into 7, the most powerfully magical number. hidden in objects across the years, each one a small dark tether holding Voldemort to the world of the living. And Dumbledore knew then what had to be done, and it was a long and lonely knowing. To destroy Voldemort, one could not simply defeat him in a duel or strike him down in battle. First, every hidden piece of his soul had to be found. Every Horcrux had to be sought out in its secret place and destroyed, one by one, until nothing remained to hold him here. Only then, when the last fragment was gone, could Voldemort be made mortal again. Only then could he truly die. It was, you might think, an impossible task. The pieces could be anywhere. They could be any object at all: a cup, a locket, a book, a ring. Disguised and hidden and guarded by spells no ordinary searcher could hope to break. A lifetime might not be enough to find them all. And Dumbledore, by then, was an old man, and he knew in the honest and unflinching way he knew all difficult things that he did not have a lifetime left to give. So he did what he had always done. He began. He gathered what he could. He set himself patiently to the work of understanding his enemy so completely that the hiding places might reveal themselves not by chance, but by reason, because a hidden thing always bears the shape of the hand that hid it. And so he turned to memory. Dumbledore possessed, in his office, a shallow stone basin carved round with runes, filled with a silvery substance that was neither liquid nor light, but something gentler than both. It was called a pensieve, and into it a witch or wizard could pour their own memories, drawn out of the mind in long silver threads, and there examine them from the outside, walk within them, see again what had been. For years Dumbledore had been collecting memories the way another man might collect letters or photographs. He sought out those who had known Voldemort as a boy, before he was Voldemort at all, when he was only a strange and clever orphan named Tom. He gathered their recollections, their glimpses, their small forgotten moments. He collected the memory of the woman who had served in the shop where a certain golden cup had passed from hand to hand. He collected the memory of an old and frightened house elf. He collected fragments and half-truths and things half-seen, and he laid them all, gently, into the silver depths of the pensieve, and he studied them, night after night, in the quiet. Piece by piece, out of all those borrowed memories, a portrait formed. Dumbledore came to know Voldemort not as a monster only, but as a boy who had once been small and unloved, a boy drawn to fine things and hidden places, a boy who collected trophies and craved the beautiful, the ancient, the significant. And knowing this, Dumbledore began to guess where the pieces of his soul might lie. For a man who hides his soul does not hide it in some plain and forgettable place. He hides it in the things he loves. He hides it in relics of the great wizards from whom he claims descent, in objects heavy with history and grandeur. Dumbledore understood this, and it narrowed the impossible task to something merely very hard, which for Dumbledore was another word for possible. But he did not mean to carry this knowledge alone into the dark, and here is where the story softens, and warms, and turns toward the boy. For there was Harry. All those years Dumbledore had watched him from a careful distance, had guarded him and guided him and let him grow, and now, at the last, he drew him close. He called Harry to his office in the evenings. That round and cluttered room high in the castle, full of curious silver instruments that whirred and puffed, and the soft red-gold plumage of a sleeping phoenix. And there, together, the old man and the boy bent over the pensieve, and Dumbledore gave to Harry the very thing he had gathered so patiently. He gave him the memories, he led him down into the silver, and side by side they stood, unseen within moments long past, and watched Voldemort's whole life unfold, from a bleak orphanage to a shabby cottage where a proud and broken family had once lived, to the day a strange boy first learned that he was a wizard. These were the private lessons, and they were unlike anything Dumbledore had done before. He was not teaching Harry a spell or a defense. He was teaching him a person. He was teaching him the shape of the enemy, the long, slow story of how a boy became the thing he became, because Dumbledore believed, deeply and gently, that to defeat something you must first understand it, and that understanding is a kind of mercy, even when it cannot save. And as the lessons went on, something changed between them. The distance that had always been there, the careful reserve of a headmaster toward a pupil, began to fall away. Dumbledore no longer spoke to Harry as a child to be protected from hard truths. He spoke to him as a partner. He asked Harry's thoughts, and he listened to them. He admitted, once when he had made a mistake, that he had been wrong. He confessed things about himself that he had confessed to no one. He let Harry see him as a man who could err, who could regret, who did not know everything, and in that admission there was a great and quiet trust. He was handing the boy his secret war. He was making him not a soldier only, but an heir. There was a sweetness in it, and a sadness too, because Dumbledore knew what Harry did not yet know, which was how little time remained. He treasured those evenings. He looked forward to them with a warmth he was careful never quite to show. And still, even in the fullness of that new closeness, he held things back. He did not tell Harry everything. He could not, for there were truths so heavy that to lay them on the boy too soon would have broken him, and Dumbledore, who loved him, chose the harder kindness of silence. And so even in his deepest trust there was a locked room, and behind that door he kept the darkest secret of all, alone. Now we must go back a little, to tell of the ring, for the ring is the wound at the center of all of this, and it must be told gently, because it is a story of longing more than of magic. In his searching, Dumbledore had found one of the Horcruxes. It was a ring, old and heavy and cracked, that had belonged to the Gaunt family, the last poor descendants of a great and ancient line, the very family from whom Voldemort was descended on his mother's side. It had lain hidden in the ruin of their house, buried beneath the floor, guarded by a curse of terrible power. And Dumbledore, who had spent his life becoming perhaps the greatest wizard of the age, went to that lonely place and found the ring and lifted it out of the dark. But the ring was more than a Horcrux. This is the part that turns the story tragic, and you must hold it softly. Set into that cracked and blackened band was a stone, and the stone was not only a stone. It was one of the 3 Deathly Hallows, the Resurrection Stone, the very object out of the old legend that Dumbledore had chased with such hunger when he was young. Long ago, as a brilliant and grieving boy, he had dreamed of gathering the 3 Hallows and becoming the Master of Death. He had dreamed of the wand that cannot be beaten, and the cloak that hides its wearer from all eyes, and the stone that can call the dead back to the living, if only for a while. That dream had cost him more than he could bear. It had ended, you will remember, in the death of his little sister Ariana, in a duel he never forgave himself for, and he had put the whole hunger away, had renounced it, had locked it deep, and refused for the rest of his long life to reach for that kind of power again. And now, after all those years, here in his hand, set into a cursed and deadly ring, was the very stone he had once longed for, above all things. The resurrection stone. The stone that could show him the faces of the dead. And Dumbledore knew it was cursed. He knew, better than anyone alive, the danger of the thing. He was the wisest man of his age, and he had spent a lifetime learning to master his own longing. He should have set the ring down. He should have carried it away untouched, to be destroyed carefully, in its proper time, by hands that knew the risk. But he was not only wise. He was also, still, an old man who had lost his family and who had never stopped grieving them. He had a mother he had watched die when he was young. He had a sister he had loved and failed, whose death he had carried like a stone in his own chest for 100 years, never certain whose hand had cast the spell that killed her, never able to lay down the guilt of it. And there in his palm was a thing that promised, for one impossible moment, to let him see them again, to look upon his mother's face, to look upon Ariana, to say the words he had never been able to say, to beg, at last, for their forgiveness. And for one instant, one single human instant, the wisdom failed. The longing was simply too great. This man who had turned away from power all his life, who had refused the wand and refused the throne and chosen the quiet work of teaching children, reached out in his grief like anyone might, like you or I might, and he slipped the cursed ring onto his finger, not to conquer death, only to see, once more, the ones he had loved and lost. And the curse took him. It was a terrible and ancient curse, meant to punish any hand that dared disturb the gaunt inheritance, and it woke the moment the ring closed round his finger. It began to kill him, spreading from his hand up through his body, a dark and deadly rot moving slowly along his veins. There was no cure for it. It was the kind of curse that does not stop and cannot be undone. In that 1 weak instant, Dumbledore had doomed himself, and he knew it even as it happened. His lifelong dream of the Hallows and his oldest and deepest grief had come together at last and become the very thing that would end him. There is a hard truth in it, and a human one. The wisest of men are undone not by their foolishness, but by their love. He might have died there, alone in that ruined house. But Dumbledore did not despair, and he did not simply give in. Even with the curse burning through him, his mind was working, cold and clear beneath the pain, and he made his way back to the castle, and he called for the one man who might help him. He called for Severus Snape. Snape was a potions master and a healer of dark wounds, a man who had walked closer to the shadows than almost anyone, and who knew their remedies as few others did. And Snape came, and he worked over the withering hand, and by all his considerable skill, he did what even he had thought impossible. He could not cure the curse, no one could, but he could hold it back. He could gather it, contain it, force it to remain within the ruined hand, and stop it, for a time, from reaching the heart. And so, Dumbledore lived. But the hand was lost. It hung at his side, blackened and shrunken and dead, the fingers curled and lifeless, a constant reminder of the moment of weakness that had cost him everything. And the reprieve was only a reprieve. Snape told him plainly, as a healer must, that the curse could not be held forever. It had been slowed, not stopped. A year, perhaps a little more. That was all the time that remained. Within a year, the darkness would spread past the hand and reach the rest of him, and then he would die. You might expect a man to break beneath such news, but Dumbledore received it the way he received all the hardest things, with a calm that was not coldness, but a kind of deep and settled peace. He did not rage, He did not weep for himself. He had faced the idea of his own death long ago, in the quiet philosophy of a long life, and he had come to see it not as an enemy, but as an old friend, waiting patiently at the end of a long day. To the well-organized mind, he had come to believe death is only the next great adventure. And so, told that he had a year, he did not spend it in fear. He spent it in work. He looked at the single year left to him not as a sentence, but as a resource, a small and precious span of time within which certain necessary things might still be arranged. And he began, very quietly, to arrange them. For here was the true weight he carried now, and it was heavier than the dead hand at his side. He was a dying man who knew too much. He knew the secret of the Horcruxes, and that they must be found and destroyed. He knew the secret of the Hallows, and the ruin they could bring to any heart that wanted them too badly, his own most of all. And he knew one thing more, the darkest secret of them all. A truth about Harry himself so painful that he had never spoken it to a living soul. A truth about what the boy would one day have to face, and what he would have to be willing to give. All of it, Dumbledore carried alone. And knowing he would not live to see the end, he set himself to the loneliest task a man can undertake. He began to plan a war he would not survive, to fight, to lay down, piece by careful piece, the steps of a long design whose final move would fall long after he was gone, trusting others to walk the path he could only begin. It is a lonely thing, to be dying and to know it, and lonelier still to be dying with the truth locked inside you, unable to share the whole of it with anyone. He could not tell Harry everything, because the boy was not yet ready, and because the last and hardest of the truths would only have crushed him too soon. He could not tell his old friends, because the plan required silence, and because some of what must happen would look, from the outside, like betrayal and defeat. He walked the corridors of his castle as he had always walked them, gentle and twinkling and kind, and no one guessed the weight he bore beneath the sweeping robes, the dead hand hidden in his sleeve, the counting of days behind the calm blue eyes. And so, in those final quiet months, he turned once more to Snape, the one man who knew the truth of his dying, and to Snape he entrusted the most difficult thing of all. For Dumbledore understood that his death, when it came, need not be only an ending. It could be made to mean something. Placed carefully, given at the right moment and in the right way, it could protect the ones he loved and turn the coming war a little toward the light. And so, calm and unafraid, with the tenderness of a man setting his house in order, he arranged the manner of his own death, and its meaning, speaking of it softly with Snape in the shadows of his office, planning the very hour that was already drawing near, an hour that would come, when it came, at the top of a high and windswept tower beneath the stars. And so, in the quiet of his own knowing, the old man made a choice that most would never dare to make. He knew that he was dying. The curse from the ring had settled into him like winter into old wood, slow and certain, and there was no potion, no spell, no gentle magic in all the world that could turn it back. He had perhaps a year, and no more. A lesser man might have spent that year clinging to every hour, hiding away, frightened of the dark that was coming. But Dumbledore was not a man who clung. He had learned, long ago and through great sorrow, that death was not the enemy the young believed it to be. It was only the next soft turning of a very long road. And so, rather than fear his ending, he began quietly to shape it, the way a careful hand shapes clay, so that even his death might serve the people he loved. There was a boy in the story now, you see, a frightened boy named Draco Malfoy, pale and thin and barely more than a child. Voldemort had given this boy a terrible task, a task no boy should ever be handed. He had ordered Draco to murder Dumbledore. It was not truly meant as an honor. It was meant as a punishment upon Draco's family, and it was meant, most likely, to end in the boy's own death when he failed. For who could imagine such a child raising his hand against the greatest wizard of the age and living to tell of it? Dumbledore saw all of this. He saw the trembling boy far more clearly than the boy could ever have guessed, and what he felt looking at Draco through all those long months was not fear for himself. It was pity. It was tenderness. It was the ache of an old man watching a young soul stand at the very edge of ruin. Because Dumbledore understood something about murder that the dark could never understand. To kill, to truly choose to end another life in cold cruelty, was to tear one's own soul. It left a wound that never fully healed. He had seen what that wound did to Voldemort, who had split his soul again and again until there was almost nothing human left in him. And he could not bear to let it happen to Draco. He could not bear to watch this pale, terrified child cross that line and lose forever the tender thing inside him that made him a person and not a monster. So the old man began to plan a mercy. If he was going to die anyway, and die he was, then let his death spare the boy. Let Draco never have to become a killer. Let that be the last gift of a dying man to a child who had shown him nothing but coldness. That was the kind of love Dumbledore carried. It reached even toward those who did not want it. And so he went to Severus Snape, the man who walked forever in shadows, the man whose loyalty was a secret kept so deep that not even the wise could always read it. Dumbledore asked something of him that no one should ever have to ask. He asked Snape to be the one to kill him. Not out of hatred, not in battle, but at the right moment, when the time came, as an act of quiet mercy. The way one might help an old and suffering friend slip gently into sleep. It was a dreadful thing to ask, and Snape did not want to bear it. But Dumbledore explained, in that soft and patient voice of his, all the reasons woven together, and there were many. It would spare Draco. It would spare Dumbledore himself a long and cruel dying at the hands of the curse, and it would do something more. Something that reached far into the war that was coming. For if Snape were the one to strike, in Voldemort's own service, then Snape's place at the Dark Lord's side would be sealed beyond all doubt. He would become Voldemort's most trusted servant, the man who had done what none other dared, and from that place, hidden in the very heart of the enemy, Snape could watch over the boy who mattered most. He could protect Harry from within, secretly, endlessly, through all the danger still to come. A death, chosen with care, could become a shield around a child. Only Dumbledore could have seen a thing so tender hidden inside a thing so terrible. And there was one more thread in the old man's quiet weaving, the most secret of them all. It had to do with a wand. Not any wand, but the Elder Wand. The Deathstone of legend. The most powerful and most dangerous wand ever made. It had come to Dumbledore long ago, and it had answered to him, and it had lain in his hand through all his greatest years. But such a wand was a terrible thing to leave loose in the world, for it drew the greedy and the cruel like a lantern draws moths in the dark. And Dumbledore, thinking ahead as he always did, believed he had found a way to still its power forever. If he died the way he had planned, at the hand of a friend, in a death he had chosen, and not lost, then the wand would gain no new master. Its long chain of conquest would simply end. The power that had passed from wizard to wizard down the centuries would die quietly with him, and the most dangerous wand in the world would trouble no one ever again. It was a beautiful plan, gentle and clever, meant to close an old wound in the world. And it is true, and you may hold this thought softly as you drift, that this one plan would go a little astray, that the wand had one more surprise left to give. But that is a story for another night, far past this one, and it need not trouble your rest now. Let it be enough, tonight, to know that even here the old man was thinking of peace. Before the end came, though, there was one last journey to make, and it was made in darkness, and it was made with Harry at his side. For Dumbledore had spent that final year teaching the boy everything he could about Voldemort's hidden soul, about the Horcruxes, those broken fragments of the Dark Lord scattered and buried across the world. And on his last night, weakened already, gray and tired, the old man came to Harry and told him he had found one, a locket, hidden away in a cave by the sea, guarded by dark and cruel magic. And he asked Harry to come with him, not to protect him, though the boy would try, but because he trusted Harry, wholly and without reserve, the way a man trusts his own heart. They flew through the night to that lonely place, the two of them, the old and the young, and they crossed the black water to a hidden island where a basin stood filled with a dreadful potion. It was a poison of despair, a liquid made to break the mind and body of anyone who tried to reach the treasure beneath it. And it could not be poured away, and it could not be pushed aside. It could only be drunk. So Dumbledore, already dying, already so weary, chose to drink it himself rather than let the boy suffer. But before he raised the first cup, he took a promise from Harry, and it was the promise of that whole final night. He told the boy that he must obey, no matter what happened. That whatever Harry saw, however terrible, however much the old man begged and pleaded and wept, Harry must keep pouring the potion and make him finish it. He gave his life over into the hands of a 16-year-old boy and asked only to be trusted in return. That was his faith. That was how much he believed in Harry, even at the very end. And it was terrible to watch. The potion carried the old man down into his darkest memories, into the sorrows he had hidden for 100 years, into guilt and fear and grief. He cried out. He begged to stop. He said he did not want it, that it hurt, that he had done wrong, that he could bear no more. And Harry, weeping himself, held to his promise and lifted each cup to the old man's lips, because he had been asked to, because he loved him, because the old man had trusted him to be strong when strength was the hardest thing of all. When at last the basin was empty and the locket was theirs, Dumbledore lay broken on the cold stone, whispering for water, so weak he could barely move. And even then, even drained to the last, when dark things rose out of the black lake to drag them down, it was the old man who found one final ember of fire in himself to drive them back and see the boy safe. He would not rest until Harry was safe. He never would. They came home to Hogwarts through the dark sky, the old man leaning on the young one, and they landed atop the highest tower, the astronomy tower, beneath the wheeling stars. But the castle below was not at peace. The dark mark hung green and dreadful above it. Death Eaters had found a way inside, called by Draco, who had at last opened a secret door. The school was under attack, and there on the tower, in the cold night air, with Harry hidden beneath his cloak and frozen still by the old man's silent spell, the trap closed. For it was Draco who came bursting up the stairs, wand raised, wild with fear, and in an instant he disarmed the old man, struck the wand from a hand too weak and too willing to hold it, and stood there trembling with Dumbledore at his mercy. Yet look, even now, at how the old man met him. He was dying. He was disarmed. He had every reason for fear, and he showed none. He spoke to the frightened boy softly, kindly, by his name, the way you might speak to a child who had woken from a nightmare. He told Draco that he was not a killer. He said it gently, as a truth the boy had forgotten about himself. He told him that it was not too late, that there was still another way, that he and all the ones Draco loved could be hidden and protected, kept safe beyond Voldemort's reach. In his very last minutes, cornered and dying atop that tower, Dumbledore was not trying to save his own life. He was trying to save the soul of the boy who had come to end it. He reached toward Draco with mercy, again and again, trying to catch him before he fell. That was the whole of the man, held in a single night. And Draco could not do it. His wand shook, and his eyes filled, and something in him could not cross that final line, just as the old man had known all along. The boy was no murderer, but the moment could not simply stop, for others were climbing the stairs now, dark figures crowding onto the tower, and among them, at the last, came Severus Snape. The old man looked at him. And here, dear one, we must tell it softly, the way you would tell the ending of a very old and gentle sadness. Dumbledore looked at Snape, and he spoke, and he said only 2 words. He said, "Severus, please," to Harry, hidden and helpless below, and to all the world that would hear of it after, those words would sound like a plea for life, a frightened old man begging to be spared. That is what they would believe. That is the story they would carry, and it would break Harry's heart. But it was not the truth. The truth was that those 2 soft words were the pulling of a promise made long before in a quiet office between 2 men who had chosen a terrible thing together. "Severus, please, please do this hard thing. Please carry it through. Please give me the death we agreed upon, and let it mean everything we meant it to mean." It was not a beggar's cry. It was the last request of a man releasing a friend to do what love required. And Snape raised his wand, and there was a flash of green light, and the old man was lifted gently up and back over the edge of the tower, and he fell. He fell through the night air like a great white bird, slow and quiet, down and down past the ancient stones, to rest at last upon the ground far below. And so the greatest wizard of the age was gone. But hold this close as you rest, and do not let it wound you too deeply, for it was not a murder, though it wore the shape of one. It was a sacrifice, chosen freely, arranged with love, carried out by a friend at a dying man's own asking. It was a mercy dressed in sorrow. It was the last move of a plan so tender and so deep that almost no one living would understand it for a long, long time. The school woke to grief. All through the castle and the grounds, they came out into the pale morning light, the teachers and the students, the tall and the small, and they gathered around the still white form of the man who had watched over them all their lives. Someone lifted their wand toward the sky, and then another, and another, until 1,000 points of light shone up into the dark, driving away the green mark of death, mourning him in the oldest and simplest way, with light. He had been their shelter. He had been the reason the castle felt safe even in the worst of years, and now he lay quiet on the grass, and the world felt suddenly very large and very cold without him in it. And Harry, poor Harry, was the most broken of all. For Harry had seen it. He had watched from beneath the cloak, frozen and silent, unable to cry out or lift a hand, as the man he loved most in all the world was struck down by the man he had always mistrusted. And now his heart was torn in two directions at once. He grieved, and he raged, and beneath it all there curled a poison worse than any in that cave, the belief that Snape had been a traitor all along, and that Dumbledore, wise Dumbledore, had trusted him and been wrong, had begged for his life and been betrayed. Harry did not know. He could not know. Not yet. The truth of those two soft words was still sealed away where no one could reach it, and so the boy carried the whole weight of it as a wound, believing the worst, believing that all the old man's cleverness had ended in nothing but a plea and a fall. They laid Dumbledore to rest by the lake he had loved, in the shadow of the school he had given his life to. A white tomb of pale marble rose there beside the still water, gleaming softly in the light, the first tomb the grounds of Hogwarts had ever held, and they came from far and wide to say farewell to him, the great and the humble, the human and the strange, creatures of the forest and the water and the air, all drawn to grieve the passing of a man who had been kind to every living thing. And when it was over, the world drew its quiet, sorrowful conclusion. The great wizard was dead. His side had lost its champion. The dark was rising, and the one man who might have stood against it lay cold beneath white stone. It looked, to every watching eye, like defeat. It looked like the end of the light. But it was not. Beneath the grief, beneath the seeming ruin, hidden from every mourner at that white tomb, something quite different was happening. Every piece the old man had so gently set in motion was, at that very moment, sliding softly into place. Draco's soul was whole and unbroken. Snape stood now at Voldemort's right hand, trusted beyond all others, watching, waiting, guarding the boy in secret. The Horcrux hunt had begun, and the knowledge to finish it had been planted, patient as a seed, in Harry's mind. The old man had not failed. He had only stepped, at the perfect moment, off the board where he could no longer be seen, so that his plan could keep on moving without him. Everything he had wanted was unfolding exactly as he had shaped it. Quietly, invisibly, in the dark. And so he was gone. This old man of the long white beard and the twinkling eyes and the endless patient love. His secrets seemed to have been buried with him beneath the white marble by the lake. The world believed the great wizard defeated, mourned, and finished. His cleverness ended in one green flash and one long fall. They did not know what he had truly done. They did not know how much of him remained, threaded through the living, waiting to be understood. All of that still lay ahead, in the telling yet to come, when at last the truth would rise up quietly out of the dark, and the meaning of the man would finally be seen for what it had always been. And so, when it seemed that everything was lost, when the greatest wizard of the age lay still and broken at the foot of the tower, and the man who had killed him fled into the night, the truth of what Albus Dumbledore had done had only just begun to unfold. For his death was not the end of his work. It was, in a strange and quiet way, the last careful move in a plan he had been laying for many years, a plan made of love and sorrow and patience, one that he had never dared to explain fully to anyone, least of all to the boy at the center of it all. He had known he was going to die. That is the first gentle thing to understand as you settle deeper into the dark. Long before that night on the tower, Dumbledore had known his time was short. His hand had been blackened and slowly dying, cursed by a ring he should never have touched, and he had accepted that his days were numbered and few. And so, rather than fight against the ending, he had begun to arrange the world so that when he was gone, the boy he loved would still find his way. He worked in secret, and he worked in silence, and he trusted that after his death, the pieces would fall into place the way he had shaped them to fall. The first of these gentle arrangements was hidden inside his will. When Dumbledore died, he left behind a few small and curious gifts, and each one had a purpose that would not be understood for a long time. To Harry he left a golden snitch, the very first snitch the boy had ever caught, small and worn and closed like a secret. Inside it, invisible for now, was hidden something Harry would need at the very end, something that would open only at the moment of his greatest need, when he had finally accepted what was being asked of him. It was a gift wrapped inside a game, a piece of hope tucked away where no enemy would think to look. To Ron, he left a deluminator, that small silver device that could gather up all the light in a room and hold it, and give it back again. It seemed at first like a simple thing, a keepsake, a curiosity. But it too had a hidden purpose. When Ron's heart faltered, when he wandered far from his friends and feared he had lost his way forever, the deluminator would carry a little light to guide him home again, and a voice, and a warmth, so that even when a friendship broke it, it might be mended. Dumbledore had understood, you see, that the journey ahead would test not only their courage, but their hearts, and he had left a small mercy for the moment, when the hearts might fail. And to Hermione, wise and thoughtful Hermione, he left an old book of children's tales, worn soft with age. Hidden within its pages was the story of the Deathly Hallows, 3 legendary objects and the old legend that whoever gathered all 3 would become the Master of Death. It was a fairy story, or so it seemed, but Dumbledore had left it deliberately, knowing that these 3 clever children would puzzle over it, and argue about it, and slowly come to understand a truth about power and about death that Dumbledore himself had learned the hardest way of all. He was teaching them, even from beyond the grave, gently, patiently, the way a grandfather leaves lessons in the things he gives away. So that was the first strand of his hidden plan. Small gifts left for the ones he trusted, each one a quiet hand reaching forward through time to steady them. And the second strand was a man. For Severus Snape, who had struck the killing blow, who the whole world now believed to be the cruelest of traitors, was in truth still working for Dumbledore, still bound to him by an old promise and an old love and an old grief. Dumbledore had asked Snape to do the terrible thing, to end his life, so that a greater plan might be protected, and so that a young boy's soul might be spared the wound of murder. And Snape had agreed, though it broke something in him, and afterward, he went back among the enemy, wearing the mask of the loyal servant, and from that dangerous place he went on protecting Harry in secret, guiding him, guarding him, watching over the son of the woman he had loved and never stopped loving. All of it on Dumbledore's instructions. All of it a hidden kindness disguised as cruelty. The world thought Snape a villain and Dumbledore betrayed, and the world was wrong on both counts, and only the 2 of them had ever known the truth. But there was a deeper secret still, the darkest and the most loving of all. And it is the one that must be told softly, because it is heavy, and because it is also, in the end, tender, for Dumbledore had come to understand something terrible about Harry himself. on the night that Voldemort had tried to kill the baby and failed. A piece of Voldemort's own broken soul had torn loose and lodged itself, quietly and unknowingly, inside the child. Harry had carried it all his life, without ever knowing. It was why he could speak to serpents, why he could sometimes feel the dark wizard's thoughts and rages moving faintly behind his own eyes. And it meant something that Dumbledore could scarcely bear to think about. It meant that as long as that fragment lived inside Harry, Voldemort could not truly be destroyed. And it meant that for the world to be free, the piece of soul within the boy would have to die. And to be certain of that, Harry himself would have to be willing to walk toward death and let it take him. Think of what that knowledge cost the old man. He had watched this boy grow from a small, thin, unloved child into a brave and gentle young man. He had come to love him, truly love him, the way a father loves a son. And all the while he had carried inside him the unbearable knowledge that he was raising this beloved boy for a moment of sacrifice, feeding him, teaching him, letting him grow strong and kind and full of life, and all of it, in a sense, so that he could one day give that life away. Like a lamb raised in warmth and tenderness for the day it would be led quietly to the altar. Dumbledore knew this, and he hated himself for it, and it haunted him through every gentle smile he ever gave the boy. He had chosen to love someone he was preparing to lose, and to let that someone believe, for as long as possible, that he was simply loved and simply safe. It was, perhaps, the thing he could least forgive in himself, out of a long life that held many things he could not forgive. And yet, even here, there was something more than calculation. Something warmer moving underneath, for Dumbledore had not planned the boy's death coldly, the way a general spends a soldier. He had also, quietly, hoped. He had studied the strange knot of magic that bound Harry and Voldemort together. The shared blood, the ancient protection of a mother's love, still living in Harry's veins, and he had come to believe, or at least to hope with all his heart, that there might be a way through. That if Harry walked willingly toward death, out of love, to protect the people he cared for, then death might not be able to keep him. That the willingness itself, the courage, and the love might be the very thing that saved him. Dumbledore could not be certain. He could only trust. He trusted in the boy's courage, which he had watched grow year after year. He trusted in the boy's capacity for love, which he believed was greater than Voldemort could ever understand. And so he laid the heaviest burden a person can carry onto the shoulders of a child, and then he trusted that child to carry it further and better than he himself ever could have. And when the moment came, the boy did. That is the part to rest your heart on now. In the quiet, when Harry at last understood what was being asked of him, he did not run, and he did not rage. He walked, alone, into the dark forest, toward the one who wanted him dead, and he let it happen. He gave himself up out of love, to save the others, exactly as Dumbledore had hoped he might, and exactly as Dumbledore had feared he would have to. And here the story becomes gentle again, and luminous, like a soft light at the far end of a long dark hall. For after Harry let death come to him, he did not simply vanish into nothing. Instead, he found himself in a strange and peaceful in-between place, a quiet, dreamlike station, bright and misty and calm, that looked something like the great train station of King's Cross, where his whole adventure had once begun. And there, waiting for him in that soft white light, was Dumbledore, the old man, looking well again, looking whole, his eyes as bright and kind as they had ever been, sat with the boy he loved in that peaceful place between one world and the next, and at long last, he told him everything. He told Harry the whole truth, all of it, the pieces of soul and the plan and the sacrifice, keeping nothing back this time. And as he spoke, the great and brilliant Albus Dumbledore, who had always seemed so calm and so certain and so far above ordinary sorrow, wept. He wept for the burden he had laid upon a child. He asked Harry to forgive him, humbly, the way one flawed person asks another, for using him, for keeping secrets from him, for loving him, and preparing him for death at the same time. He confessed his own weakness, his own long-ago hunger for power, the mistakes that had shaped his whole life, and Harry, standing in that gentle light, looked at the weeping old man and understood him at last, not as a distant perfect wizard, but as a person, cracked and sorry, and deeply, deeply loving, and Harry forgave him. In that quiet place, the two of them were finally completely honest with each other, an old man and the boy he loved, no more secrets between them, only truth and tenderness and the soft white light all around. And Dumbledore gave him, there, the last of his hard-won wisdom, the things he had learned across a long and difficult life. He told Harry that pity the living, and above all those who live without love. He told him that words are our most inexhaustible source of magic, capable of both wounding and healing. He told him, gently, that of course it was all happening inside his own head, but that this did not make it any less real. And he told him the truest thing he knew, the belief that had cost him the most to learn, and that he held on to more firmly than any spell or any prize, that love, plain and ordinary and overlooked, is the deepest and most powerful magic there is, stronger than any wand, stronger than any hollow, stronger than the fear of death itself. For that, in the end, was who Albus Dumbledore truly was. Not a flawless saint, though the world remembered him almost as one. Not a wise old wizard untouched by darkness, gliding serenely above the struggles of lesser people. He was a real man, and a flawed one, and that is the last and softest truth to carry down with you into sleep. He was brilliant, one of the greatest minds his world had ever produced, and yet he had learned to be humble about it. He was endlessly kind, and he was also, when he judged he had to be, quietly calculating, willing to plan and to sacrifice and to keep terrible secrets in service of what he believed was right. He was capable of enormous love, and he had also, once, long ago, been capable of a dangerous and frightening ambition, a young man's dream of power and glory that had nearly swallowed him whole. And he had never fully escaped the shadow of that younger self. All his long life he had been haunted by his sister, the fragile girl who had died in a moment of chaos that he had helped to cause, never knowing for certain whether it was his own spell that killed her. All his long life he had grieved the brilliant friend of his youth, the one he had loved and dreamed with, and then lost forever, when their dreams turned dark. Those two losses had marked him more deeply than anything, and out of them he had learned the lesson that shaped everything he became afterward. He had learned to distrust his own hunger for power. He had understood, better than almost anyone, that he could not be trusted with too much of it, and so he had spent the rest of his life quietly stepping back from the thrones and the offices and the great powers that were offered to him again and again, choosing instead to teach children, to guide from the shadows, to serve. He atoned, in his gentle, patient way, for the whole of his long life, for the mistakes of a single reckless summer. That is the man to hold in your heart as the story closes. not a wizard of impossible perfection, but someone far more comforting than that. Someone broken and human underneath the long silver beard, who carried an enormous weight of guilt, and carried it, in the end, with grace. He knew the difference between power and goodness, because he had tasted the hunger for power himself and turned away from it, and he had learned that being able to do great things is not at all the same as being good. He forgave others easily and himself only, with great difficulty, and yet he kept trying, day after day, quietly, to do right by the people who depended on him. He made terrible choices and loving choices, and often they were the very same choice, and he lived with all of it, and did not let it turn him bitter. Let the listener rest now in the warmth of that complicated old man, a person who was wise and foolish, gentle and hard, guilty and forgiven, all at once, the way real people are. Let it be a comfort as you drift that even the greatest and the wisest are broken and human underneath, that they too carry their sorrows and their old mistakes, and that they can still, in spite of everything, spend their lives trying to do good. Forgiveness and guilt carried with grace, and the quiet triumph of love over power. These are the soft and steady things to fall asleep upon, and now, you know it all. You know the whole long life of Albus Dumbledore, from the bright and gifted boy to the grieving young man, from the wandering scholar to the beloved old headmaster, from the darkest secret to the luminous forgiveness at the end. There is nothing more to gather up, nothing more to hold, nothing left to understand. You can let all of it go now, gently, the way he learned, at last, to let things go. Let the great castle grow quiet in your mind, its 1,000 windows going dark one by one. Let the wide black lake lie smooth and still beneath the stars. Let the small white tomb by the water rest undisturbed in the soft night air, holding safe the man who tried, in the end, to do right. And let even that image begin to soften and fade. There is nothing you need to carry. The story is finished, and the old man is at peace, and so may you be now. Let the warmth stay with you, and the words drift away. Let the castle fade, and the lake fade, and the quiet white tomb fade into the dark. And let the dark, so soft and so gentle, carry you slowly, slowly, all the way down into sleep. And so we come to the quiet end of it, the whole long life of Albus Dumbledore laid gently behind us now. The boy in the hidden cottage, the grieving young man, and the summer that scarred him. The humble teacher who would not touch the power he feared in himself. The old headmaster with the twinkling eyes and the terrible secrets. The dying man who arranged his own death out of love, and who met a boy at the end of everything to weep and ask forgiveness. You followed all of it, the whole winding way, and now you can let it go. Because that was never really the point of tonight, was it? You don't have to carry any of it into the morning. Let it all grow soft and far away now, the names, the sorrows, the long-kept secrets, until they are only a warm blur at the back of your mind. A story someone told you once, in a low and gentle voice, on a night when you finally let yourself rest. The knowing was only ever the boat. And you've nearly reached the shore. So let it all settle now. Let the great castle grow quiet, its 1,000 windows going dark, one by one. Let the still black lake lie smooth under the stars, and the white marble tomb beside it rest in peace. Let all the old griefs and the old guilt and the long, hard, loving work of a good and complicated man fade down into the dark, gently, the way a fire settles into embers, and then into a soft gray warmth. There is nothing out there tonight that needs anything from you. There is nothing you have to decide. Nothing you have to hold. Nothing you have to be. There is only your breath, slow and easy, and the weight of you sinking down into the quiet. If there is one small thing to keep, let it be the gentlest thing he believed, that in the end, after all the wands and all the power and all the cleverness, it was love that was the strongest magic of all. He spent a whole long life learning that, the hard way, and he gave it to a boy at a railway station at the end of the world. You can hold that, softly, as you drift. Love is the strongest thing, and you are held by it now, wherever you are, whoever you are, safe in the dark. You did a kind thing for yourself tonight, choosing to rest. I'm glad you spent this time here with me. If some small part of you is still awake enough to hear this, let my voice be the last of it now, going quieter and quieter, like footsteps walking softly away down an old stone corridor until they fade into nothing at all. Sleep now, sleep deeply, and sleep well. The castle will keep, and the story will keep, and everything can wait for morning. Thank you for spending this night with me, and if you drifted off long ago, well, then this was only for the quiet. Good night. Sleep well. And the sweetest of dreams to you. I'll be right here whenever you need somewhere gentle to land again. Good night.